Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 21. November to December 1916. Once Thomas was settled into the hospital routine, he didn't spend many of his waking hours at the house, which was a relief. After a few days, Major Clarkson had deemed it acceptable for him to take his meals with the other orderlies when he was on duty. It was a substantial drop in quality compared to Miss Patmore's cooking, but meant he didn't have to deal with William's eagerness for stories of life at the front, O'Brien's open skepticism about the severity and even existence of his wound, or Carson's general disapproval of everything down to the way he breathed. The other orderlies, by way of a refreshing contrast, treated him uncomplicatedly as one of the group. His association with the big house did prompt a few questions about who the nurses Crawley were in civilian life, and why Sister Crawley wasn't called Lady Crawley, but that was about all the special interest they took in him. They were about a section's worth of orderlies, most of them medically disqualified from overseas service, flat feet, asthma, heart murmurs, and the like. But there were a couple of others who had been put on home service after being wounded overseas, and they had settled the others' curiosity about the front before Thomas got there, either by satisfying it or discouraging it. Thomas didn't ask which. The other orderlies were all privates, and the nursing staff consisted of the two nurses Crawley, two more VADs, and a private duty nurse of about Sister Crawley's vintage, who before the war had primarily nursed elderly ladies, and found the switch to a busy, if small, military hospital to be a challenging one. As a result, among the support staff, Thomas was second only to Sister Crawley in terms of experience, and was soon entrusted with complicated cases, helping to assess newly arrived patients and other kinds of skilled work. The pace of new arrivals was fairly sedate. They got a convoy about once a week, and the occasional single patient, usually someone in stable condition who'd been transferred nearer to home. But the work was steady because they were usually at full capacity, or at least near to it, and every case they saw was serious enough to warrant being sent back to England. One day's convoy, for instance, brought them 3 amputations, 1 leg, 2 arm, a couple of chest cases, some nasty flesh wounds, and a gut wound. The latter had gotten through the most dangerous stage, hence his evacuation to England, and had some chance at surviving, but required irrigation of the wound every 2 hours around the clock, in hopes of preventing a fatal infection from developing. Thomas was doing one of these, explaining to one of the other orderlies as he went, when he became aware of Sister Crawley watching him. He wondered if perhaps he wasn't supposed to be doing this, but she didn't tell him to stop, so he went on. "So this tube is for the fluids to drain out? You can tell because it's lower. If you put the antiseptic in here, it'll just come right back out. Though, that won't do him any harm if you made that mistake, as long as you realized you'd got it wrong and did it over properly." The orderly, Franklin his name was, nodded. "Because it won't have done him much good either, Cook." "Right." He tapped the drainage tube. "You also want to make note of how much fluid you're putting in and how much you're getting out. It's normal for it to be a bit less, a couple of CCSs, but if you're not getting most of it back out, that means—"
"Well, it's still in there," Franklin said. "Is that bad for him?"
"Depends on what kind of solution it is," Thomas said. "The stronger antiseptics can damage the tissue if they're left in contact too long. This shouldn't, but if it's not coming out, the MO is going to want to know, so he can find out why. If it's a new patient, it could be the tubes aren't placed just right, or if it was draining properly before, there could be some new swelling or adhesion in there. It's not our job to sort out what's gone wrong, just to notice that something has, and bring it to the MO's attention." The fluid had finished draining out, so he held the glass collection jar up to the light. "If there's more of it, or if it's a drastically different color coming out than it was going in, that's another thing the MO should hear about. Or if it's noticeably foul-smelling. What do you make of this?"
"It's a bit pink, isn't it? From blood?"
Thomas nodded. "That's not too surprising, especially given he's just been moved, and the colour's very faint, but I might note it on the chart. What do you think, Nurse Crawley?"
"I quite agree," she said. "I don't think it's anything to be concerned about at this stage, but we'll want to keep an eye out for further signs of internal bleeding."
She moved off then, leaving Thomas and Franklin to continue the irrigation, but returned a few minutes later with Major Clarkson. Thomas really thought he was in for it then, but they were in the middle of redressing the wound, so he carried on.
Right, and then one more layer of bandage over the ends of the tubes so we're not leaving the door wide open for germs to get in.
Once Franklin had finished that, he straightened up and said, "Sir, Mum," nodding to them in turn.
Corporal Barrow, the major said, would you be able to take night duty tonight?
That certainly wasn't what he was expecting.
Of course, sir, he said.
I know it's short notice, said Sister Collie, but we need someone here who knows how to do Captain Prescott's dressing changes, and I'm expected at a Red Cross function in Ripon. And you'll have done night duty in France, I expect.
I have, he agreed.
Splendid, said Sister Crawley. I would cancel, but I'm giving the lecture, you see, so it would disappoint everyone. Perhaps you could go home and have a bit of a rest now and come back after supper.
Thomas glanced at Major Clarkson, who nodded.
Yes, ma'am.
So after asking a few questions about the procedure for summoning a medical officer, should one be required, and whether anyone else would be on night duty, one of the other orderlies, and a VAD, he walked up to the house. It was close to tea time, and after supper at the hospital was several hours before the servants' dinner, so Thomas decided he had better put off resting in favor of getting something to eat while he could. When he got to the servants' hall, Anna looked up from a bit of sewing and observed,
"You're back, Ellie."
I got put on night duty, he explained, slipping into the seat next to Anna's. A complicated case just arrived, so they need someone experienced.
Across the table, Miss O'Brien scoffed. Thomas ignored her.
So they sent me off to rest and get something to eat before I report back in the evening. Something occurred to him. Do you know if anyone has an alarm clock?
Anna considered.
I don't think so, but I'm sure someone can wake you.
Given the option, Thomas would rather have relied upon clockwork than anyone he could plausibly ask. Anna couldn't do it, as she'd have to enter the men's corridor.
But he didn't have the option, and so said, I hope so. It's important I get back on time. Miss Crawley has an engagement in Ripon, so she can't stay.
I hope you don't mean Lady Sybil, said Mr. O'Brien primly.
No, Nurse Crawley is senior,
Thomas clarified, then added,
Well, they could both be going, for all I know. It's a Red Cross lecture. One of the other VAD girls is on duty.
Anna put down her sewing and gave him an incredulous look.
What?
Miss O'Brien answered instead. You personally, Mr. Carson, who you're calling Lady Sybil, a VAD girl. She said it loudly enough that had Carson been anywhere nearby, he'd no doubt have come rushing into the room to avenge the insult. Fortunately, he didn't seem to be. He was likely dealing with the upstairs tea at this time.
Thank you for that reminder, Miss O'Brien.
The really irritating part was that she was right. At the hospital, it would have been fine. That was how they were referred to as a group, and the younger Nurse Crawley didn't want any distinction made between her and the other two VADs, who were the daughters of a banker and a curate. But they weren't at the hospital. About then, Daisy came in to lay the tea.
Thomas? What are you doing here?
So he had to explain again. When he'd finished, she asked, What sort of case is it?
An abdominal wound,
he said.
The risk of infection is extremely high, so it's got to be specially cleaned every 2 hours and monitored for the slightest sign of trouble.
Ethel, who had taken her place down below Anna while Thomas was explaining, propped her chin on her hand and said, They must think a great deal of you to bring you in special for something so important.
Ethel saying things like that was another reason he preferred to eat with the other orderlies when he could.
Anna claimed that she wasn't taking the piss, but that kind of fawning was difficult to take any other way.
Well, I am the most experienced orderly they have, and the other senior nurse isn't quite accustomed to army work.
That was a bit of a euphemism. Thomas had recently learned that Nurse Whitby had in fact worked in an army hospital during the South African War. Unfortunately, the intervening decades of private duty work hadn't exactly helped her to keep up to date with the latest advances. O'Brien said in her butter wouldn't melt in her mouth voice,
And I suppose they wouldn't entrust something so complicated to a mere VAD girl.
Thomas sighed inwardly.
No, Miss O'Brien, as a matter of fact, they would not.
VAD girls got about as much medical training as orderlies did before starting out, but none of the ones at their hospital had much experience on wards yet.
The young ladies of the voluntary aid detachment might work on the complicated cases under supervision, as might the less experienced orderlies, but for night duty they want someone who knows his way around an abdominal wound.
Under whose supervision, I wonder? Miss O'Brien asked. Thomas stared at her. Would he really have fallen into such an obvious trap before? More people were coming into tea now, and it was plain that she wanted him to say something that would sound like he was putting himself above Lady Sybil. Carefully, he said,
Nurse Crawley Senior supervises the nurses. I help out with showing the other orderlies how to do things.
In fact, the other orderlies now treated him as though he were the corporal of their section, which he would be if he were actually assigned to the hospital.
He added, The army always has nurses under the authority of another woman, a ward sister or a matron, who reports to the medical officer. Prevents any appearance of impropriety.
There! That firmly established that Sister Crawley was in charge of matters of propriety regarding Lady Sybil, and if O'Brien made any further insinuations, it would be a member of the family whom she was criticizing.
Oh, that sounds very sensible,
said Miss Patmore, who had arrived just now with a plate of cold meat. Then she added, What are you doing here at this hour? Which required Thomas to explain again. Daisy returned with a loaf of bread just as he was finishing up. Shall I make you some sandwiches to take with you, since you'll be missing dinner? Thomas had, in fact, been thinking of going into the kitchens to see what he could get his hands on before leaving for the hospital.
If you would, he said, and if Miss Patmore doesn't mind.
It's no trouble, Daisy said.
Miss Patmore added, Make them after we've cleared the tea and before we start on the dinner. I don't want you knocking about making sandwiches at the busiest time of the day.
They finished laying the tea, and Carson and Miss Hughes came in. When they'd all stood up, and before sitting down, Carson looked at Thomas and said accusingly,
What are you doing here?
Thomas took a deep breath, preparing to explain it a fourth time, but Anne jumped in, saying, They asked him to do night duty tonight, so he's come back for a meal and a rest beforehand. Carson huffed and finally sat down, allowing the rest of them to sit down and start filling their plates. When the clamor had died down, Anna turned to Bates and said, Would you go and wake Thomas up when it's time for him to go back to the hospital? Thomas was glad she'd done the asking. He'd not have minded if it was William, but he'd be busy getting ready for the upstairs dinner at that time.
Just after you dress his lordship for dinner, he added.
I suppose,
said Bates.
Everyone else will be busy with the dinner, Thomas explained, and I can't be late.
O'Brien added,
It's very important. A man could die if Thomas isn't there to clean his wound.
Thomas hadn't said that, though there was some truth in it.
More likely Miss Crawley would stay to do it and be late for her speaking engagement.
I won't forget,
Bates said. It wasn't him forgetting that Thomas was worried about exactly.
If they put me on night duty regularly, I'll get an alarm clock.
You won't be here too much longer, will you?
William asked. Thomas was trying not to think about that.
My medical panel's in about a month, yes,
he said. He did think he had a good chance of it coming out right, but he was no closer to figuring out what he'd do if it didn't.
I won't know when exactly until I get my orders for it.
It was probably a good idea to get that out there. If he was still here 2 months to the day after he'd arrived, he'd probably have to explain that 500 times too.
I wish they'd send me my orders,
William said. No, you don't, Thomas thought but said instead.
If you're lucky, maybe it'll be over before you get them.
In fact, Thomas wasn't sure why William hadn't been called up yet, or Branson for that matter. There weren't many men their age left in the village, as far as Thomas had seen. It was just them, a few farm workers who were probably classified as essential, and the slow boy who delivered for the butcher shop.
I want to do my bit,
William said. Thomas scoffed involuntarily, and William added,
I mean it. I believe in this war and what we're fighting for. I'd be sorry not to be a part of it.
Irritated, Thomas said, And what is that? What are we fighting for?
William opened his mouth, then closed it again.
You believe in it, but you don't even understand it. All right.
Now Thomas noticed everyone, including Anna, had stopped eating to look at him.
Shall I tell you? When you get your wish, and they drop you in a trench, you'll find out that you're fighting to keep yourself and your mates alive another day, and to keep the lice out of your clothes, and the rats out of your rations. If you're so keen to find out what it's like, you should come down to the hospital when the convoys do and take a look.
He could have said more, but they were at the table, and there were ladies present.
Perhaps I will,
William said.
You do that, Thomas said. And bear in mind, these are officers. You can't expect half as much consideration when it's your turn.
With that, Miss Hughes determinedly turned the conversation to plans for Christmas, and how nice it would be if Mr. Matthew, who was in England on a training course, was able to get away for a day or two.
I don't know why he has to give me a hard time,
William said to Anna. Tea had finished a bit ago, and Thomas had gone off to bed, and most of the others off to their work. Now it was just her, William, and Miss O'Brien, to whom William cast a sidelong glance down the table where she sat unpicking a bit of lace. He'd seen enough to realize that it was she who had been antagonizing Thomas, Anna supposed. If she wasn't sitting right there, Anna would have laid the blame solidly on her, but instead she said, "Maybe don't mention wanting to go to the war around him."
He wants to go back to France, William pointed out. He talks about it often enough.
Thomas would not, Anna knew, thank her for explaining that he wanted to go back because he felt more accepted there than he did here.
That's a bit different. For him, it isn't about the war in general. He wants to be back with his comrades. Mr. Bates has said that you get very attached to the people you go through an experience like that with.
Down the table, Miss O'Brien scoffed, and expected an insinuation about the nature of Thomas's attachment to his war chums, though why she'd bother without an appreciative audience, Anna wasn't sure. But instead she said,
"Do they want him back as much, I wonder?"
"I expect so,"
Anna said, puzzled as to what Miss O'Brien could be getting at. Something unpleasant, certainly.
"He gets letters from them."
"He got letters from here, too," she pointed out. "I expect they feel sorry for him, just as we all did when we heard he was shot."
That was true. But, Miss O'Brien continued,
"It's a bit strange when you think about it, how he came to be shot. What was he doing at the front at the most dangerous hour of the entire war?"
"Collecting wounded," Anna said flatly. "That was his job."
"Well, yes, but isn't that surprising, as he's meant to be such a medical expert now? I wonder that he wasn't behind the lines treating patients instead of bringing them in, that's all."
Anna hadn't thought about that. Thomas did like to seem important. It wouldn't be out of character for him to have exaggerated his expertise. Still, he didn't know why Miss O'Brien would try to make an issue out of it. They were all used to Thomas's ways. Except for Ethel, but Miss O'Brien disliked her too. Miss O'Brien continued,
"As a matter of fact, didn't he tell us before we left that they put men on more dangerous duty if they were in some sort of trouble?"
He had said that, hadn't he? And I had forgotten all about it. It was the sort of detail Miss O'Brien would file away in case it could be useful later.
"That's a dreadful thing to do."
"Yes,"
Miss O'Brien said, her expression suddenly very far away.
"Yes, it is."
And then she turned her attention back to the lace.
"Corporal Barrow,"
Nurse Fairchild said, approaching him with a patient chart. It was a few hours into the night shift, and they were doing a round of temperatures and pulses on the newly arrived and otherwise delicate patients.
"Yes?"
Thomas asked, noting Captain Prescott's temperature reading, normal, on his chart.
"I've just done Lieutenant Turnbull's temperature, and it's a bit elevated,"
she explained, holding out the chart. Thomas took it. The temperature was more than a bit elevated. It had been a bit elevated in the afternoon, and had risen at each check since then.
"Have you checked his wounds?"
Nurse Fairchild hesitated.
"There's nothing showing through the dressings, and Nurse Whitby said not to disturb them."
Thomas sighed inwardly. Those were Nurse Whitby's initials next to the last few temperature readings. In the South African War, Thomas knew from Corporal Jessup and the wardmaster, it had been thought best for a wound to be disinfected once, well wrapped with a sterile dressing, and left alone. Removing the dressing, if it wasn't visibly soiled, was thought to do more harm than good by exposing the wound to germs, and that method had usually worked. In South Africa, the trouble was that the wounds sustained in the trenches of France and Belgium were much dirtier to begin with. Anything that had been in the trenches for any length of time, including the enemy's ammunition and the man's own clothing, harbored millions of germs which the bullet or shrapnel carried deep into the wound. A single round of disinfection was never enough to get them all, so keeping the wound covered only trapped them inside. Major Clarkson explained this to Nurse Whitby at least once a week, and she claimed to understand perfectly, but remained leery of the modern practice of frequent dressing changes, and if not watched, would delay or even skip them altogether.
"Nurse Whitby," Thomas said, "is not precisely au courant with the latest developments in wound care. Best to have a look."
Thomas finished up with Captain Prescott, and then joined Nurse Fairchild at Lieutenant Turnbull's bedside. He was awake, and telling her that his arm was
"Awfully sore."
Lieutenant Turnbull, another of the day's new arrivals, had caught a spray of shrapnel along his right side. None of the wounds were particularly large or deep, but there were a lot of them, encompassing his arm, torso, buttock, and thigh. Nurse Fairchild was cutting away the gauze that secured the dressings on his side.
Let's look at the arm next, then, Thomas said. These look all right, but I'd clean them before dressing them again.
Lieutenant Turnbull winced a bit as Nurse Fairchild swabbed the torso wounds with antiseptic, and then a lot more as she peeled back the dressing from his arm.
That really does smart,
he said. After checking his chart to see when he'd been medicated last, Thomas said,
You can have a bit of morphine if you'd like, sir.
Oh, I don't think it's as bad as all that,
Turnbull said.
A cigarette, maybe?
Of course.
The other orderly on duty, Private Dixon, was doing a dressing change of his own, so Thomas gave the lieutenant one of his own cigarettes rather than going to get some from the hospital supply.
Private stock there, Corporal?
Turnbull asked, accepting it.
Don't tell, Thomas said, or everyone will want them.
Could you hold that light a little bit closer?
Nurse Fairchild requested. Thomas did so and saw that the wound on Turnbull's biceps was red and swollen, definitely developing an infection, but not too bad yet. It was a little surprising that his temperature was as high as it was.
We'll want to clean that out thoroughly and have the Major look at it in the morning, he said.
Lieutenant Turnbull coughed a little and said,
It's actually the one lower down that really hurts.
The other wound was a couple of inches above the wrist. Small, but Thomas had thought, when he first saw it, that it was likely to prove more trouble than all the rest down the road a bit when it came time to find out how much use he had of the hand. He'd been right about it being trouble, but for the wrong reason. Even before Nurse Fairchild had removed the last layer of the dressing, a gangrenous stench wafted up from it, and when the wound was finally exposed, Thomas could see not just inflammation and pus, but the telltale streaks of redness that indicated the infection was spreading through the blood vessels. Nurse Fairchild drew back a little, giving Thomas a startled look.
It's not that bad, is it?
Turnbull asked. It was obvious he was making an effort to keep his tone light.
It's not good,
Thomas said tactfully.
You might want to rethink that morphine, sir. It's going to hurt quite a bit when we clean it.
Well, if you insist,
Turnbull said with a hint of gratitude.
I do think it would be best, sir.
Thomas went to fetch it, and a moment later was joined at the drug cupboard by Nurse Fairchild.
That's rather bad, isn't it?
Thomas nodded.
It's bad, and it's come on fast. I saw it earlier today, and it wasn't like that.
He waved over Dixon, who had finished his dressing change, and said,
You'll need to go and fetch Major Clarkson.
He nodded.
Is it the abdominal case? No, Turnbull. Right on, shrapnel, gangrene.
If it was the abdominal case, there wouldn't be much for a medical officer to do. Dixon nodded again and dashed off, and Thomas continued to Fairchild.
The main thing is to keep him calm until the morphine's taken a bit of the edge off. Let's help him into the consulting room and give him an injection there.
The consulting room was close enough to the surgery that Dixon and Fairchild could manage getting him there on a stretcher, if need be. Looking at Fairchild to see if she understood, he said,
We're taking him to the consulting room so that we can have good light to clean the wound out thoroughly without waking everyone else up. That's all.
She nodded uncertainly. No, she didn't understand.
If he asks whether we're getting ready to amputate, we say that's for the doctor to decide, but we do our best not to give him a reason to ask.
Now she understood.
Do you think he is going to amputate, I mean?
Thomas shrugged his good shoulder.
He might try debriding it first, see if there's any improvement.
Thomas didn't think it was likely, not with the infection as bad as it was. They went back to Turnbull and got him into his clothes, giving him the official story about taking him into the consulting room for the light. He looked suspicious, but didn't ask any inconvenient questions. Once he was settled on the examination couch and had had his injection, they did, in fact, start cleaning the wound, which they were doing when Major Clarkson arrived. He was sleep-rumpled with his jacket unbuttoned and his necktie off. Lieutenant Turnbull was woozy but conscious, and the Major did a better job of concealing his reaction to the situation than Nurse Fairchild had, saying only, "That does look like a bit of infection in there," before stepping away from the patient and gesturing to the two of them. They joined him at the other end of the room, where he was exchanging his uniform jacket for a white coat.
"I hope you were right to send for you, Doctor," Nurse Fairchild said.
"You were," Major Clarkson said grimly. "When was the dressing last changed?"
Not long after the convoy arrived, sir, Thomas said. I didn't notice anything amiss then. Who took over the case after you?
Neither of them answered. Nurses didn't drop their mates in the shed either.
Shall I bring you the chart, sir?
Thomas suggested.
Yes.
So Thomas went and got it. They'd left it at his bed in the ward, and then held it where Major Clarkson could see it as he was washing his hands.
Do I need to ask why Nurse Fairchild didn't check the wounds the first time she took his temperature?
Major Clarkson asked.
Probably not, sir.
He sighed. Once the Major had examined the wound and said a few vaguely reassuring things to Turnbull, who was still somewhat conscious, he called Thomas, Dixon, and Fairchild into his office.
Corporal, have you worked in theatre before? No, sir. Bit of surgical prep, but that's all.
He nodded.
Dixon, go and fetch Mr. Fielding, who was the anesthesiast, and Nurse Crawley, senior, of course.
Dixon said,
Yes, sir,
but looked a bit hesitant. Guessing that it was over the idea of waking up a lady in the middle of the night, Thomas said,
It's all right. You'll get her butler, a man named Molesley. Just tell him she's needed at the hospital, and he'll take it from there.
Major Clarkson added, Once you've done that, you can go back to your duties on the ward. Nurse Fairchild, stay with Lieutenant Turnbull until Nurse Crawley arrives, then you can go back to the ward as well. Barrow, start getting the operating theatre ready. Mr. Fielding will tell you what else to do when he arrives. They all scattered to their various tasks. When the rest of the team arrived, Thomas was a little surprised to find himself ordered to join them in the operating theatre instead of being sent back to the ward. There was not, in fact, very much for him to do during the operation, but given Major Clarkson's question, it seemed plain enough that he was supposed to be paying attention to what Sister Crawley did. The main things seemed to be providing Major Clarkson with the instruments he needed and taking away the ones he was finished with. Positioning Turnbull's arm the way Major Clarkson wanted it, and sopping up blood so that he could see where he was cutting. Mr. Fielding, in addition to administering the anesthesia, gave regular announcements of Turnbull's pulse and respiration rates, as well as how long he had been under anesthesia. The operation certainly didn't take long, maybe 20 minutes. Major Clarkson took the arm a few inches below the elbow, first cutting the skin and muscle with a scalpel, then applying a small saw to the bone. The latter made a sound that was sickeningly like and unlike the sound of a saw cutting through wood. It took Thomas some effort not to shudder. He supposed that was another reason he was here, so he'd be used to it when the time came for him to actually assist. Once the bone was severed and the arm placed into a tray, Sister Crawley handed it to Thomas, who was not at all sure where he was supposed to put it. Major Clarkson folded the muscle and skin over the stump and stitched it up, putting in a couple of drains for irrigation while he was at it. Once that was done, he stepped back and nodded to Mr. Fielding, who removed the mask from Turnbull's face. The two gentlemen left, and Nurse Crawley told him, Now we dress the wound, as usual. You can take that out to the incinerator later, and he goes back into the consulting room until he's come out of anesthesia.
Yes, ma'am,
Thomas said, and set the arm aside.
You haven't seen one of those done before, I take it? She asked as they worked.
No, I've seen them before and after, but not during.
She nodded. It can be a bit disquieting.
Yes, ma'am, that's a good way of putting it.
Chest and abdominal surgeries are more complicated, she went on, but I find I'm more bothered by amputations. The moment where a limb goes from being a part of a person's body to an object, and a fairly loathsome object is that, is difficult to witness.
Thomas nodded, making a vague sound of agreement. He wished she'd stop talking about it.
That hand might have written a love letter or played a musical instrument or held a newborn child, Nurse Crawley continued. And now it's
meat, Thomas blurted out before he could think better of it.
Precisely, she said. From dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return.
Thomas very carefully did not think about all the bodies he had known, which were now returning to dust. Fortunately, Sister Crawley allowed the subject to drop.
Now, I don't think Lieutenant Turnbull realized he was going in for an amputation, did he?
Thomas shook his head.
Not that I know of. I think he had an idea something had gone wrong, but it'll be a shock when he comes round.
I'll sit with him, she said, unless you'd rather do it and I see to Captain Prescott's next dressing change.
If it's all the same, I'll take Captain Prescott, ma'am,
Thomas said cautiously.
Comforting people when they've had bad news isn't my best area.
Sister Crawley smiled.
I'm rather good at it, so that's what we'll do, She reached toward the roll of gauze, and he handed it to her. "That's one of the difficult things about this work, isn't it? Sometimes it helps to form a bond of sympathy with a patient, while at other times you must distance yourself so that you can do what needs to be done. Most people, I find, are better at one or the other." Thomas hadn't really thought of it that way before, but there was something in it. He was certainly very good at distancing himself.
"Yes, Mum,"
he said. "For me, it's rather easy to sympathize. I just think of my son and of what their mothers would want me to do." She smoothed the bandage over Turnbull's stump. "But that does make other things more difficult." Things like watching them get bits hacked off, Thomas supposed. "So, all in all," she continued, "isn't it lucky that we aren't all alike? Nurse Whitby, for instance, is very good with helpless patients, feeding and washing and so on, and making it so they don't feel humiliated." She looked sadly at Turnbull's stump, and Thomas knew it wasn't coincidence that she was talking about Nurse Whitby just now. "And they do, you know. They feel it especially keenly when it's one of the young women helping them, but also when it's another man. I must do a better job as acting ward sister of putting her where she can do the most good." The comparison would surely have shocked either of them, but at that moment, Sister Crawley reminded Thomas strongly of the wardmaster. He'd not have put it that way. He'd have said something like, "I knew she was fucking shit at wound care, and I shouldn't have put her where she could cause the man his harm to begin with," and then poured himself a drink. But it was the same sort of thing, really. So he nodded and said,
"Yes, Mum. Play to her strengths, like."
"Precisely. I think we're finished here. Could you ask Private Dixon to come and help me move Lieutenant Turnbull into the consulting room?" So Thomas found Dixon and sent him in, then began gathering up the supplies for Captain Prescott's dressing change. Naturally, given that Thomas had just mentioned how he wasn't very good at comforting people, it was during this dressing change that Captain Prescott began to wake up. He started stirring a little as Thomas removed the dressings from his wound, and when Thomas had just started the first round of irrigation, said,
"What's that?"
"Just cleaning a wound, sir," Thomas said as reassuringly as he could.
"Feels awfully queer."
He had the funny accent, hard to place.
"Yes, sir, I imagine it does."
Captain Prescott then craned his neck to look down at his stomach.
"It's best if you lie flat, sir,"
Thomas said.
"Huh,"
Prescott said, subsiding back onto the pillow, closing his eyes.
"Is this England?"
"Yes, sir," Thomas said. The antiseptic solution was starting to drain out now and looked clear.
"Yorkshire. Always wanted to say England. Mother country."
"Australian, that was what the accent must be."
"Well, now's your chance, sir."
He was trying to sound cheerful, but even in his own ears it rang false. Prescott opened one eye then and fixed Thomas with a penetrating look. He didn't actually say, "Yeah, right," but he didn't have to. Sister Crawley imagined her son when she needed to connect with a patient. Thomas didn't even have to reach that far. He knew exactly what it was like to think you were dying and have everybody pretend you weren't. Of course, he actually hadn't been dying. Captain Prescott wasn't dying by this minute either, but he was a long way from being out of danger, although he might have more of a hope than he thought he did. Thomas was still trying to sort out what to say when Major Clarkson came round. "Corporal," he said, picking up Prescott's chart and scanning it. Prescott had his eyes closed again, but Thomas had a feeling he was still awake, and so said,
"He's alert, sir."
Before Major Clarkson could say anything he might not want the patient to hear.
"First time since he's been here that I know of."
"Good," Major Clarkson said, bending down toward the patient. "Captain Prescott, how are you feeling?"
"Like somebody thrown a fucking hole in my stomach," Prescott said. "Pardon my language."
"Well, yes," Major Clarkson murmured. He came around to the side of the bed where Thomas was working, and Thomas shifted to one side to give him a better view of the wound. "That's coming along nicely," he said. "How's the solution look?" It was finished draining, so Thomas held the jar up for him to see.
"Clear," he reported. "There were some traces of blood last time, but even fainter than in the afternoon."
"Excellent," Major Clarkson said. To Prescott, he added, "You're in good hands here, Captain." And to Thomas, "You can give him 1/10 of a grain of morphine when you've finished with that."
"Yes, sir."
Captain Prescott said,
"Before you—"
But Major Clarkson had already walked away.
"He's left, sir,"
Thomas said. "Is there anything I can help you with?"
"Yeah,"
said Prescott.
"Before you dope me up again, you could take down a message from my wife."
"Of course, sir," Thomas said, relieved that it was that simple.
"Once I've finished with your wound, I'll get a pen and paper."
"Before that,
you can give me the straight shit." and we'll tell Anna goodbye.
Damn.
Well, sir, I would say the straight shit is... we don't know.
Captain Prescott opened his eye again to give Thomas another skeptical look.
I expect you know that abdominal wounds are always dangerous, but some men beat the odds. It's too soon to tell whether you're one of them, but so far so good.
I've got a chance, you mean?
Yes, sir.
He hesitated, thinking of Anna and Miss Hughes worrying over him when all they knew was that he'd been wounded, and of himself in the days between the newspaper reports about the Albion and the telegram.
But these things can change course quickly. What I would suggest is that we write one message to send now, and another that we'll put aside. That way your wife isn't kept waiting for news, but if your condition worsens and there isn't time to write again, you'll have said what you want to say.
All right, Prescott said. Let's do that.
So after irrigating the wound again and redressing it, Thomas fetched writing materials and sat down again by Prescott's bed. Prescott began the letter with a few things about how much he loved his wife and their child, who had evidently been born after he shipped out. Thomas was considering whether to hint that this might not be the information for which she was most anxiously waiting when Prescott dictated,
"But I suppose you want to know about my wound. It's a pretty bad one, Marge."
He paused for Thomas to catch up writing.
"I was shot in the stomach, and the orderly says that's always... what did you say it always was?" "Dangerous, sir," Thomas said, "but we might put cause for concern."
"Yeah, I'll put that."
He resumed dictating.
"But it's not doing too badly so far, and I might be one of the lucky ones."
He shut his eyes, and after a moment Thomas asked,
"Is there anything else, sir?"
"Yeah. They have me in a hospital in... where did you say this was?"
"Yorkshire."
"Yorkshire, England. Everyone's real nice, and they're taking very good care of me."
He took a deep breath and continued,
"It's beautiful here. Everything's so pretty and green you wouldn't believe it."
Yorkshire was more gold than green at this time of year, but Thomas wrote it.
"I'll write again when I can, and if I can't..."
After waiting a moment for him to finish the thought, Thomas said,
"I can write to her if there's bad news. Shall I say that?"
"Yeah, say that."
So Thomas wrote, "The orderly here will write instead." Prescott continued,
"So keep your chin up, dearest, and hope for the best. Love, Peter."
Thomas's hand shook on the final word.
"Here," he said. "I'll hold it so you can sign."
Prescott signed his name and drew a little heart. His hand was shaking too.
"We can write the second one later if you'd like, sir," he suggested.
"No," he said. "Better keep on."
The second message was longer than the first, with more of the love stuff, and a description of Captain Prescott's home as he remembered it, and advice to his infant son. He was pale and sweating by the time he finished it, more than ready for his morphine injection. Thomas was pretty relieved to give it to him, too. There was nothing urgently demanding his attention when he finished, so he stepped outside for a cigarette. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, only a couple of hours now until the day shift came on. He was still smoking it when Sister Crawley came outside. He started to get up, but she quickly said, "As you were, Corporal," and so he sat back down again. Carson wasn't likely to come walking by and see, not at this hour. She updated him on Lieutenant Turnbull. He'd come round enough to receive the news, but hadn't really taken it in, she said, before they'd dosed him with morphine again and put him back to bed.
"We'll be taking his temperature and checking the wound every hour for the time being."
"Yes, ma'am."
"And how is Captain Prescott?"
"Still holding steady," Thomas said. "He came round and had me take down a letter to his wife."
"Good," she said. To be sent now or held until..."
"One of each."
"Good," she repeated. "I'm glad I caught you here, because we should discuss the schedule for the rest of the day. I do think one of us ought to plan on taking night duty again tonight."
Thomas agreed, and they decided that it made the most sense for him to take it, and for her to take the day shift. He'd stay on a couple of extra hours so that she could go home and get a bit more rest before coming in at mid-morning instead of first thing.
"If you don't mind," she added. "It's not ideal, but I think it's the best we can do."
"Yes, ma'am," he said. "Sounds fair."
After a bit of discussion of duty assignments for the morning, she headed for home, and Thomas went back in to work. The rest of the night shift was thankfully free of any new crises, although Lieutenant Turnbull's temperature did not come down. There was also no objection when the other orderlies and nurses reported in to Thomas's giving out their duty assignments in the acting ward sister's absence, though we did check over his shoulder for Mr. Carson or anyone else from the house before informing the younger Nurse Crawley that she, along with the other VAD nurse and 2 orderlies, would handle the first round of bedpans. It was when that chore was just about finished that the trouble started. Nurse Crawley stormed up to him and informed him, "Lieutenant Tanville had his arm amputated during the night."
"Yes," Thomas said. "I was here. That was the emergency."
He'd explained to everyone that Nurse Crawley Sr. was coming in late because there had been an emergency and she'd worked part of the night shift as well.
The wound on his arm was infected, so we called Major Clarkson in, and he decided on an immediate amputation.
"I noticed his temperature was rising last evening," Nurse Crawley said in a tone of high dudgeon. "I wanted to check his wounds, but Nurse Whitby told me not to."
"Yes," Thomas said. "She left Nurse Fairchild with the same instructions."
"If I had, there might have been something more we could do," she said. "Isn't that right?"
Thomas hesitated. She wasn't wrong, but it wasn't quite that simple either.
"Possibly. There's no way to know."
"So it's Nurse Whitby's fault. She refuses to accept the modern methods, and now this is the result."
She almost certainly didn't realize the position she was putting him in, Thomas knew. Nurse Whitby, whatever her faults, was a fully qualified nurse, and they were an orderly and a VAD girl. It wasn't their place to criticize her. But of course, it had never not been Lady Sybil's place to do anything. Carefully, Thomas said, "The acting ward sister is aware of the problem. We discussed it a bit."
"And what's she going to do about it?"
"For now, she's assigned Nurse Whitby to feeding and blanket baths, which are well within her expertise."
"That's not good enough," Nurse Crawley said. "If she's endangering patients, she shouldn't be here."
"That's for the chief medical officer and the ward sister to decide,"
Thomas reminded her, and it wasn't as though there were an unlimited number of nurses to pick from. It might be Nurse Wilby or nothing. That wasn't something her life as Lady Sybil had given her any way to understand either.
"You might talk to the senior Nurse Crawley when she comes in,"
he suggested. She was certainly more qualified to explain why the younger Nurse Crawley was unlikely to get her way.
"She'll likely be able to tell you more about what's been decided and why."
Nurse Crawley nodded, composing herself.
"Yes, I suppose you're right."
She changed the subject.
"Will you show me how to do the dressing changes for Captain Prescott?"
Thomas hesitated. They'd never precisely discussed whether he was meant to open training the young ladies. They hadn't even discussed whether he'd help train the orderlies. He just started doing it. But he'd already told her no once. Doing so again might press his luck.
"If you're caught up with the duties the ward sister assigned to you, you can watch."
"I will be," she said eagerly. "When's the next one?"
"About an hour,"
Thomas said, and she hurried off to get on with the morning chores. Sure enough, Nurse Crawley popped up at his elbow while he was getting the supplies for the dressing change.
"He came round for a bit while I was doing one of these last night," Thomas said. "He probably won't this time. He wore himself out. But if he does, just be matter of fact. He knows his condition's serious, and he doesn't want a lot of flannel."
She nodded, an expectant look on her face.
"But don't be too gloomy either. We're cautiously optimistic."
"I understand."
"But don't bring it up unless he does."
"I have worked with serious cases before,"
she pointed out. Thomas had learned a bit from Jessup and the wardmaster about dealing with young officers who were a little too inclined to throw their weight around, but not about ones who were just a little too keen. If she were a man, the thing to say would be, "Yes, sir," so he went with,
"Yes, nurse."
She gave him a sharp look, but didn't object. Despite Thomas's misgivings, once he started the procedure, it seemed natural enough to talk through the procedure the same way he would if he were showing it to another orderly. And Nurse Crawley proved an apt student, answering his questions thoughtfully and not, as he'd feared, insisting on taking over the procedure herself. If she had, he'd have had to find a way to say no. It was, he reflected a while later, as he started the walk up to the house, probably the longest conversation he'd ever had with one of the family. Definitely the longest if you weren't counting the time he'd shouted at his lordship in his dressing room and then cried, which Thomas would most certainly prefer not to count. Thomas rounded a curve in the drive, and as if summoned out of the ether by Thomas's thoughts, his lordship appeared. Fortunately, he was far enough away that Thomas could quickly dodge to the right side of the path and so correctly salute with his right hand. His lordship, Colonel Grantham, stopped a short distance from him, and returned the salute. That was a mercy in a way. If they ignored you, you had to keep standing there until you decided it was safe to stop saluting. But it certainly did look as though Thomas might have to actually speak to him. Did he know Thomas was here? He had to, didn't he?
Corporal, he said with a nod. He didn't sound particularly surprised or outraged, so he must have known.
Colonel?
Maybe he'd leave it at that. Thomas wasn't that lucky. Good. Her ladyship and I were both sorry to hear you'd been wounded.
Thank you.
Was it my lord or sir when they were both in uniform?
Sir.
Colonel Grantham did not actually explode, so Thomas supposed he'd got it right. I think this is the first I've seen you since you've been back.
What was he supposed to say to that? Why would he have seen him? It wasn't as though he was a proper guest. Or was he hinting that Thomas didn't seem to be making himself useful at the house, as he promised he would when he asked to stay? That had to be it.
Yes, sir. I've been helping out at the hospital. Mr. Carson didn't think it right that I work in the house.
No, said his lordship. It wouldn't quite look right, would it?
What did he mean by that? Before Thomas could ask, or even think about whether there was some way he could ask, Colonel Grantham changed the subject.
How are things at the hospital?
Well enough, sir. We had a bit of an emergency last night with a patient, but he seems to be on the mend.
That wasn't quite true, but it wasn't as though he could say, we cut off a man's arm and he still might die.
Good. And I suppose you'll see Lady Sybil when she's on duty.
Oh, this was about not becoming too familiar with Lady Sybil, was it? That wasn't too excruciating, particularly since his lordship had to know that Thomas was the last person to fraternize with her in the euphemistic sense.
In passing, sir, he said, the young ladies are honorary officers, you know, and mostly work with the other enlisted men.
Of course, but you must know the sorts of things she's doing.
After examining the question from all angles, Thomas admitted,
Yes, sir.
And is it suitable for a young lady?
Perhaps this wasn't about Thomas at all. Perhaps it was about Lady Sybil doing things like giving men baths and
seeing them naked.
Thomas was fairly sure that presented with a list of a VAD's duties, Lord Grantham would not find it entirely suitable, but fortunately it wasn't his place to have an opinion about that.
The acting ward, Sister Crawley, Miss Crawley, that is, has charge of the young ladies, what's suitable for them to do and what should be left to the men.
There, that was absolutely true, but implied something more reassuring than the unvarnished facts.
I see. I suppose that's the usual arrangement.
Yes, sir. Larger hospitals have a matron over the ward sisters, but there are only a few nurses here.
Colonel Grantham nodded.
Thank you. I won't keep you.
After another exchange of salutes, they parted ways. Thank God. Is everyone finished with this? Daisy asked, and without pausing for an answer, put the last of the cold veal and ham pie they'd had for the servants' tea onto a plate.
Doesn't Miss Pamfor keep something for you in the kitchen?
Ethel asked. I'm putting it aside for Thomas, Daisy explained, so he can eat something before he goes down to the hospital. He's on night duty again, you know. They did all know that. He'd made an appearance at lunch before going up to bed for the afternoon, but Miss O'Brien said,
I'm surprised they asked him to again after last night.
Anna knew better than to give her the satisfaction of asking, but unfortunately William didn't.
What happened last night?
He asked.
One of the orderlies had to go running for poor Mrs. Crawley in the middle of the night, she said. I heard it from Mr. Mosley.
Why? Daisy asked.
He didn't say.
Miss O'Brien answered primly, as though she wouldn't have bumped him for as much information as he had to give.
Only that there was an emergency, one which was beyond Thomas's abilities, evidently.
It is a hospital, Miss Hughes pointed out. I expect emergencies aren't uncommon.
It's surprising is all I'm saying, Miss O'Brien replied, after he took such pains to make sure we knew how they rely on him there.
That wasn't entirely fair, but Anna wasn't quite sure how to say so. For one thing, saying anything at all would just give Miss O'Brien the opportunity to make more insinuating remarks. After a moment, Carson said,
Well, we all have work to be doing, don't we?
Anna hoped to be able to ask Thomas just what had really happened at the hospital the night before, but he hadn't come down yet when the dressing gong rang, and by the time she came back down from dressing Lady Mary and Lady Edith, Lady Sybil hadn't returned from the hospital yet. He'd already left. But she did end up hearing about it from Lady Sybil, who came home when the rest of the family were halfway through dinner. She went straight up to her room, and Mr. Carson instructed Anna to take a tray up to her. When she took the tray up, Lady Sybil had already changed into her dressing gown and was sitting at the dressing table taking her hair down. "Oh, good," she said, clearing a place on the dressing table for the tray. "I'm famished." "I shouldn't wonder," Anna said, "putting in such a long day." "I hope Mamma isn't cross that I was late," Lady Sybil said, picking up her fork. "I was speaking with one of the patients. He had his arm amputated early this morning." Anna had the impression that amputations weren't unusual in a military hospital, but said, "How dreadful," as she collected Lady Sybil's nursing uniform, which she'd left neatly folded on a chair. She hoped that Lady Sybil would say more, and she wasn't disappointed. "It is. He's a young lieutenant just my age, his right arm. But the most dreadful thing about it is that it needn't have happened if his wound had been looked after properly." Was Miss O'Brien actually right? "Really, my lady?" she said encouragingly. "The wound became infected, so Dr. Clausen had to amputate to prevent it from spreading," Lady Sybil explained. "But if we'd spotted the infection sooner, we'd have been able to at least try to save his arm. His dressing hadn't been changed for nearly 12 hours. Oh dear. Dressing changes were just what Thomas had been talking about. "I'm sure everyone did their best, my lady," she suggested. "Well, some of us did," Lady Sybil said tartly. "And Captain Prescott is still holding steady, you'll be glad to hear," Sister Crawley said. "We'll continue to irrigate the wound every 2 hours, and he's to have intravenous fluids at about 5 a.m. "Very good, Mum." She was doing the handover to the evening shift, briefing him on all of the cases requiring special attention. "What about Lieutenant Turnbull?" She hadn't mentioned him yet, though Thomas had noticed on the way in that his bed was still occupied. He'd at least lived through the day. "He isn't doing so well, I'm afraid," she said with a sigh. "His temperature is still quite elevated, and I don't like the looks of the second arm wound, or the stump for that matter." "I see. Nurse Fairchild will monitor his temperature hourly throughout the night. We just did his dressing change together, so she knows how to do it and what to look for, but I'd like you to look in when she does it." Thomas nodded. Hourly checks meant they were very concerned about Lieutenant Turnbull. "Yes, Mum." He hesitated. "Do you know if they're thinking of doing another amputation?" If the MOs thought the infection might still be confined to the arm, they might try amputating further up. If they weren't considering that option and the case was as serious as Sister Crawley's instructions implied, that would mean the infection was systemic and amputating wouldn't do any good. "Yes, Major Clarkson said if there's no improvement by morning, they may operate again. If his condition worsens..." She trailed off. "Captain Wren Lewis is the medical officer on call tonight," she added. "Private Dixon knows where he's billeted." "Yes, Mum." After that, there were a few more cases for her to bring him up to date on and a final round of bedpans for the day shift orderlies to finish up, and then the night watch began. It was a busy shift. With 3 of them on night duty, each was responsible for about 30 to 40 patients. Fortunately, most of them slept through the night without requiring anything. Last night, Thomas's patients, apart from Captain Prescott, had mostly been in that category. Now that Nurse Fairchild was doing hourly checks on Lieutenant Turnbull, the cases had been reshuffled, with her taking a few of Thomas's easy patients, and him taking a few of her needier ones. For instance, last night he'd had a dozen temperatures and pulses to check at mid-shift. Now he had 18 and 3 more who needed to be checked twice. Instead of 6 patients getting pills and 2 getting injections, he had 10 pills and 4 injections. Added to that were the ones who weren't scheduled for anything but woke up and wanted something. Drinks of water, bedpans, cigarettes. Pretty much the only time he got to sit down was when he was doing Captain Prescott's dressing changes. Lieutenant Turnbull, when Nurse Fairchild called him over for the dressing change, was pale and restless. "How's his temperature?" Thomas asked. "Between 103 and 104, she said. "Sister Crawley said it's been like that all day and to send for the captain if it reached 105. Thomas nodded. The temperature was high enough that any further increase could be dangerous. "Has he been conscious at all?" "Not really. He's been murmuring some and moving about. Like that," she added as Turnbull writhed in his sleep. Poor bastard. "Well, let's see how it looks."
Nurse Fairchild removed the dressings from Turnbull's arm. The stump was red and swollen, but not actually dripping. The upper arm wound was more inflamed than when Thomas had seen it last, with a fair amount of pus.
"It doesn't smell quite as bad as last night," she said hopefully.
"No," Thomas acknowledged. "It certainly didn't look good, though. Has Nurse Crawley shown you how to do the irrigation on the stump?" She nodded and picked up the bulb syringe to introduce the antiseptic. When it drained back out, it was yellowish and cloudy.
"That's about how it looked last time," Nurse Fairchild said.
"All right," Thomas said. "Second round should be clearer."
It was, which meant that the treatment was doing some good. But Thomas doubted it would be enough. The fever suggested the infection had got into his blood, and it wasn't as though they could disinfect that. It would kill him before it killed the infection. Nurse Fairchild moved on to cleaning out the upper arm wound, swabbing out the pus and saturating the area with antiseptic, and then to the other wounds on Turnbull's torso. These, Thomas thought, looked a bit worse than they had the night before. Not as septic as the arm was, but definitely a bit inflamed.
"Did you look at these with Sister Crawley too?"
he asked.
She nodded. "Yes. She said these probably wouldn't really need redressing, but that I should check them, and I might as well redress them while I was doing it."
"How do they look compared to this afternoon?"
She moved the light closer and looked carefully.
"About the same, I think. This one on his chest might be a bit redder."
She looked over at him.
"Do you think we need to send for the doctor?"
"Not if there's no major change since the afternoon."
The only thing the doctor could do that they couldn't was amputate more of the arm, and if he thought that was indicated, he'd have done it before he went off shift.
"You generally call for an MO at night if the patient's gone downhill. If he was already in bad shape when they left."
Nurse Fairchild nodded.
"Yes, I see."
Thomas waited to see if she'd say anything else, and when she didn't, told her,
"Clean the wounds out well and keep doing his checks,"
and went to check on his own patients. When Thomas was doing Prescott's last dressing change of the night, the captain woke up. After watching Thomas for a moment, he said,
"So I'm still here."
"Yes, sir,"
Thomas said.
"How's it look?"
"About the same, which is good news in the circumstances. How does it feel?"
"About the same,"
Prescott echoed.
"Though now you mention it, I almost feel like I could eat."
"You'd have to talk to the medical officer about that, sir."
With an abdominal case, an interest in eating was a good sign, but introducing food into the damaged digestive organs was more likely than anything else to trigger an infection or hemorrhage.
"I can give you a cigarette if you like."
"All right,"
Prescott said.
"Better wait till I'm finished with this, though,"
Thomas added. The second round of irrigation was still working its way through.
"This stuff's a bit flammable."
Prescott huffed. It was almost a laugh.
"Wouldn't want to go up like a Christmas pudding,"
he agreed. Now there was a mental image.
"You'd likely have to drop it right in the wound,"
Thomas said.
"but let's not risk it."
The antiseptic solution finished draining, and Thomas started redressing the wound.
"You posted that letter?"
Prescott asked.
"Yes, sir."
"Good. Of course, by the time she reads it."
Thomas wasn't sure how long it took for a letter to get to Australia, but it seemed like it would have to take at least a couple of weeks. Maybe longer.
"Yes, sir. We'll likely know more by then. For now, every day you get through without a change for the worse, your chances get a bit better."
The shift limped on. Close to dawn, one of Dixon's patients had a nightmare. Battle dream by the sound of it, and his carrying on woke up everyone around him, which resulted in a number of requests for bedpans, pain medication, and cigarettes. When they'd finally got them all settled down again, it was just about time for the day shift to come in and make a start on the morning. Thomas was not surprised to see Major Clarkson, Captain Red Lewis, and Sister Crawley gather around Lieutenant Turnbull's bed shortly after they arrived, nor to see Nurse Fairchild and the other Nurse Crawley in whispered conference. He was a little surprised, however, when Nurse Crawley parted from her fellow VAD and made a beeline for him.
"Poor Lieutenant Turnbull isn't doing any better, it seems," she said.
"No," Thomas agreed.
She shook her head. "It's such a waste,"
she said, turning to give a look of dislike to Nurse Wibley, who was collecting bedpans from the sink room.
"All of it's a waste, Nurse Crawley,"
he said.
"Of course, but—"
She clammed up at the sight of Sister Crawley approaching.
"Haven't you got something to be doing?"
Sister Crawley asked her.
"Yes, sister,"
Nurse Crawley said, and hurried off to do it.
"We're going to try another amputation," Sister Crawley told him. "If you don't need to go off duty immediately, you can assist along with me."
Thomas was in no particular hurry to go up to the house. Better if he got there once they were all through with breakfast and had scattered to the day's tasks as far as he was concerned. Yes, Mum.
This time Thomas did most of the assisting, while Sister Crawley hung back, occasionally pointing out to him which instrument it was that Captain Wren Lewis was asking for. The operation took longer, as they were taking the arm off at the shoulder, and the anatomy was more complicated. Captain Wren Lewis also debrided the chest wound and several others. The scarring, if Lieutenant Turnbull lived, was going to be horrendous, but that was the least of anyone's worries right now. Returning downstairs mid-morning, after seeing Lady Mary off to pay some calls, Anna found Thomas sitting in the servants' hall, looking at a newspaper and eating a bit of breakfast that Daisy had put aside for him.
"It seems we hardly see you working at night," she observed.
I expect some people like it that way,
Thomas said. He wasn't wrong, but he did wish he'd pay more notice to those of them who were glad to have him home, rather than dwelling on Miss O'Brien and Mr. Carson.
He continued, I'll be doing it for at least the rest of the week. We've got a couple of difficult cases now.
Anna nodded. She'd hesitated over whether to ask Thomas about what Miss O'Brien and Lady Sybil had mentioned, but that seemed the perfect opening.
"Lady Sybil said a young lieutenant had to have his arm amputated."
Thomas gave a guilty start. When did she... Oh, you mean the first time? He set down the toast he was eating. Yes, she spoke to me about that, too. She's taking it hard. She'll likely be even more upset when she comes back. We amputated again this morning further up, but I have my doubts it'll do any good.
"You mean he might
Die? Yes.
He sounded matter-of-fact about it, almost horrifyingly so.
Lady Sybil said,"
Anna hesitated,
"that it might not have been necessary if the wound had been cared for properly."
She wondered if he'd deny it. Thomas nodded.
She thinks that. It might be true.
He shrugged his good shoulder and picked up his toast. Anna knew that Thomas could seem callous at times, but even for him, shrugging off the preventable death of a young man seemed a bit much.
"And is that all you have to say about it?"
she said incredulously.
What else is there to say?
He finished the toast and lit a cigarette.
It all came on very quickly. I checked the wound myself when he first arrived. It looked all right then. 12 hours later he had a raging infection. Nurse Crawley's of the opinion that if it had been checked earlier in the evening, there might have been more. That could be done. And as I say, she could be right, but there's no way to know. And patients often go a lot longer than 12 hours without having their wounds checked, especially when they're being moved. He reached up and rubbed his left shoulder, adding, Mine certainly did.
Thomas didn't often draw attention to his wound like that. Anna couldn't help wondering if he was doing it now as a play for sympathy.
"So you're saying this is just routine?"
Unfortunately, yes. Most of the men listed as died of wounds actually die from infection. I understand why Nurse Crawley's upset. He didn't seem too badly off at all when he arrived. Even before the first amputation, he was chatting with us and in good spirits. He gave her a sidelong look. And he's a nice-looking bloke. Or was, anyway. But if she asked my advice, which she hasn't, I'd suggest she be a bit more circumspect about assigning blame. You might mention it if she asks you, or comes close to asking you.
Anna's eyes widened.
"You want me to warn Lady Sybil off for you?"
Or don't, Thomas said with a shrug. Sister Crawley might have it in hand, I'm not sure. He pushed his chair back. I'm for bed. Can you ask Mr. Bates? Still haven't had a minute to look for that alarm clock.
"Yes, of course,"
she said. No matter what else was happening, the hospital still needed him to get there on time. Anna was still a bit unsettled when Mr. Bates returned to the servants' hall and contrived to meet him in the boot room.
"Have you spoken to Thomas?"
she asked.
Not since yesterday. Am I supposed to wake him up again?
He asked resignedly.
"Yes," she said. "He does mean to get an alarm clock, but I suppose it's difficult. He'll probably need to go to Ripon or Thirsk for it."
It's fine.
Mr. Bates said.
I'm already most of the way to the top of the house at that time, dressing his lordship.
"Did he mention anything about a young lieutenant who had to have his arm amputated?"
No? Why?
She tried to think how to explain.
"There's some question about whether he was looked after properly," she finally said. "And now it seems they had to amputate again this morning, and he might not live."
That's unfortunate.
Then he looked up from the shoe he was brushing.
Do you mean they're saying Thomas might not have looked after him properly?
Anna hesitated.
"I'm not sure."
I know Miss O'Brien's been dropping hints that he's not as much of a medical expert as he makes himself out to be, but I didn't think there was anything in it. At least nothing more serious than him puffing himself up a bit.
Well, Lady Sybil told me about the lieutenant. She didn't mention Thomas's name.
And this was happening yesterday.
Mr. Bates asked.
I think so,
Anna said, trying to straighten out the order of events.
Yes, the first amputation was the night before last, and Lady Sybil spoke to me about it last evening.
All he talked to me about was whether he ought to call his lordship Sir or my lord when he's in uniform.
Mr. Bates said with a shake of his head.
I suppose he could have decided to worry about that all of a sudden, after he's been back a month, if he's on thin ice otherwise. Thomas?
Bates said, knocking at the door.
I'm up.
Thomas called, throwing off the covers and sitting up. He must have been more tired than he thought. Yesterday the sound of Bates limping down the passage had been enough to wake him. The door opened a crack and Bates's beady eye peered in.
Are you... Christ!
Thomas's shoulder had been bothering him a bit, and after wrestling his way out of his uniform, he hadn't bothered putting on the top to his pajamas. It wasn't hard to guess what Bates, now pushing the door open further and stepping in, was looking at. Thomas had gotten used to the sight of his wound, a crater on his upper chest and shoulder, but it was undeniably gruesome.
Not sure you should be walking in on blokes and this habile, he said. Somebody might get the wrong idea.
Sorry,
said Bates. But he didn't leave, so Thomas reached for his shirt and pulled it on. If anyone did notice that Thomas was half naked and had a man in his room, it wasn't Bates they'd blame. He got a bit stuck in it. His shoulder really was a bit stiffer than usual, and he heard Bates taking a step toward him, but fortunately he managed to get it on before Bates actually helped him with it, or whatever he'd been planning to do.
Does it hurt?
Bates asked.
Some, Thomas said. It's playing up a bit today. Changing the weather, maybe.
Bates nodded.
Mine does that.
Since he still wasn't leaving, Thomas asked,
Did you have a chance to ask his lordship about what I'm supposed to call him?
Not yet,
Bates said. Thomas didn't suppose there was any hurry. He'd gone a month without running into him. He might well go another, and be gone before the issue arose again.
I don't think he's too bothered, honestly, but I'd hate to get it wrong in front of Carson.
Thomas did have a sort of nagging anxiety that if Carson found out there was such a thing as FB1, he'd find a way to put Thomas on it. He knew it wasn't terribly realistic, but he'd had a couple of hair-raising nightmares on the subject.
Carson's tense enough with the looming prospect of maids in the dining room,
Bates said in a tone of agreement.
Is there anything else that's bothering you?
Besides his shoulder, or besides Carson? No, Thomas suspected, which he supposed would work either way.
Anna mentioned something about a lieutenant having his arm amputated.
He shouldn't have said that about Turnbull being good-looking. He meant it as a reason why Nurse Crawley was taking it hard, but he could hardly clarify that.
It's Lady Sybil that's bothered about that, Thomas answered. I've seen dozens of them. Hundreds, probably.
And there's nothing different about this one.
Not really, Thomas answered, puzzled. I mean, I assisted with the operations. Hadn't done that before. But it was fine. I only told Anna about it because I thought Lady Sybil might want to talk about it.
And in the hopes that Anna would help keep her off the warpath in regards to Nurse Wibley. But Anna didn't want to do that for some reason.
If you don't mind, I'm going to get dressed now.
Bates seemed mildly preoccupied as he dressed Robert for dinner, but that wasn't terribly unusual these days. He'd let on a while ago that he was attempting to divorce his thieving shrew of a wife, and from the absence of new information on the matter, Robert gathered it wasn't going as he hoped. But it was a different subject he brought up, in response to a polite question from Robert about how things were downstairs.
Now that you mention it, Thomas,
he said, and Robert's stomach sank a bit,
is wondering whether, if he were to speak to you, he ought to call you Sir or my lord, seeing as you're both in uniform.
That was a relief. Robert had been expecting to hear about some sort of contremps with Carson.
I did run into him the other day on the way down to the village, Robert said.
How had Thomas addressed him then?
Sir, I should think. As you say, we are both in uniform.
Even though Robert felt a bit of a fraud wearing it, his actual duties with the North Riding Volunteers being limited to regimental dinners and occasionally reviewing the men on parade.
How is he otherwise? I hope he's recovering well.
I happened to see the wound today. I've been waking him for night duty down at the hospital,
Bates explained as he put Robert's cufflinks in.
It looks worse than I would have guessed, but it doesn't seem to slow him down much.
Robert had wondered a bit why Thomas was heading toward the house in the morning. Making himself indispensable down there, is he? Perhaps they'd keep him on, and Carson wouldn't get him back as a footman after all. Bates hesitated.
Have you heard something, my lord, about how he's making out at the hospital?
No, Robert said. Was there something he should have heard? The hospital is her ladyship's department.
Yes, my lord,
Bates said quickly, bringing Robert's evening coat.
Why do you ask?
Bates hesitated again.
I'd heard they've been having a difficult few days there, my lord, that's all.
I see,
Robert said, and privately resolved to ask Cora if she had heard anything. Arriving at the hospital, Thomas found screens set up around Lieutenant Turnbull's bed. For a moment he wished he had taken Bates up on the offer to talk about it. It was true that he'd seen dozens of amputations, as well as dozens of patients succumbing to infection after seemingly minor wounds. But this would be the first time since his own seemingly minor wound that he'd actually watched one die. He suddenly and vividly remembered being stacked up somewhere with a lot of other walking cases, the collecting post maybe, or the improvised tent ward at the station, and being struck by the absolute conviction that if he didn't disinfect his own wound, nobody would. There had been a crate of antiseptic a short distance away. He could see it now, with a scrape in the wood where it said, "But 2 dozen." He'd staggered over to it and dumped a whole bottle into his shoulder then, with a guilty feeling as though he'd just snagged the last spot in a lifeboat, attempted to do the same for a few of the other unfortunates nearest him. He wouldn't have needed to. The others, Rollins, the wardmaster, Captain Allenby, Jessup, had looked after him. There hadn't been enough time to look after everyone properly, but they'd taken care of him, like he was somebody important. It wouldn't happen here. Anna and Miss Hughes might make a bit of effort. Aunt Daisy, she'd been going above and beyond, packing him picnic suppers for his night shifts, not just the sandwiches she'd mentioned, but deviled eggs and slices of cake and things. But the others, Mr. Carson especially, would be scrupulously fair. Treat him the same as anyone else. If the 47th had treated him like anyone else, he might very well be dead.
Corporal Barrow, are you all right?
It was Sister Crawley. Where she'd appeared from, he had no idea.
Yes, ma'am. It's a shame about Lieutenant Turnbull.
Yes, it is, she said with a sigh. His fever has risen and the other wounds have all gone septic. He won't last the night.
Thomas had gathered that from the screens.
Yes, ma'am. Is anyone available to sit with him?
Nurse Crawley has volunteered, she said. He's quite delirious, but there's some chance he may wake and be capable of imparting some message that his people would like to hear.
And if he didn't, they'd make one up, Thomas knew.
Does she know what to expect?
Sister Crawley nodded. We've discussed it, and I'll send word up to the house that they're not to look for her before morning.
She went on to brief him about the other patients. Captain Prescott continued to do well enough that they had considered reducing the frequency of his dressing changes.
But since Nurse Crawley has been taking care of Lieutenant Turnbull, we'll keep doing them every 2 hours for tonight.
For the same reason, a number of Thomas's cases were transferred back to Nurse Fairchild, which would give Thomas an easier night. After discussing a few more cases, Sister Crawley said,
I'll just go and speak to the girls. Nurse Fairchild has attended deathbeds before, but not many, and then leave everything to your capable hands.
Yes, ma'am.
In the library, before dinner, Robert was fixing himself a drink when Carson came in. He spoke briefly to Cora, who spoke rather sharply to him, then softened, apologizing perhaps, and then came over to him.
It seems Sybil will be staying the night at the hospital, she said, adding with some asperity, Cousin Isabel was kind enough to inform us.
Did you say why? Robert asked. They'd discussed night duty before. Sybil had informed them that the other young ladies took their turn at it, but neither Robert nor Cora was entirely comfortable with the idea of her passing the night in a building full of men. They had not precisely forbidden it, but Cousin Isabel had agreed to defer the matter for a later time. It did seem a bit sneaky for her to handle it in this way.
Only that there was a patient needing special attention, and Sybil volunteered,
Cora said. That wasn't so very surprising. Sybil did seem keen to tackle anything the hospital threw at her,
and setting her apart from the other VAD nurses was a recipe for resentment. Robert had learned in his days in the army that a junior officer from a prominent family had to be careful about avoiding any appearance of special treatment if he wanted to fit in with his fellows. Robert might not have thought of it that way before, but, as Thomas had reminded him, she was an honorary officer. Not that Cora would be very impressed with that argument, impatient as she was with Robert's own wish to do more for the war effort.
Thomas is there, he offered instead. Bates mentioned he's on night duty at the moment. I'm sure he'll keep an eye out.
Thomas, Cora said with a slight roll of her eyes. He wouldn't be my first choice as a guardian of our daughter's virtue.
He's done it before, Robert reminded her, and with complete discretion. There was no telling what could have happened if word had gotten out about the Turk in Mary's bedroom.
Don't remind me, said Cora, glancing over at Mary, who was, unsurprisingly, bickering with Edith about something. Obediently, Robert shifted the subject.
Speaking of Thomas, have you heard anything about how he's working out at the hospital?
Should I have? She asked.
Not that I'm aware, Robert asked. Bates hinted that there was some sort of difficulty.
I see, said Cora. I'll look into it.
Well, to hear him tell it, O'Brien said, carefully unpinning Cora's hair, it's a marvel they ever managed without him.
Cora met her eyes in the mirror. Well, he is a man. Goodness knew Robert had difficulty understanding how the army could possibly conduct a war in France while he was in Yorkshire. They shared a fond smile at men and their little ways before O'Brien continued.
I shouldn't be surprised if he's puffing himself up a bit, but it may be more than that. The first time he was on night duty they had to send for Miss Crawley, and now Lady Sybil, it does make me wonder.
You think perhaps he isn't reliable?
Oh, not as knowledgeable as he pretends, O'Brien suggested, and I imagine it would be difficult to tell him to stop coming, since he doesn't really work there. They might even worry that the family would object, as he's staying here.
Dr. Clarkson hasn't said anything like that, Cora said.
I'm sure he'd hesitate to, as this family has done so much for the hospital. As she began braiding Cora's hair, she mused, I really do wonder about that wound of his.
What about it? Cora asked.
Oh, I don't like to say, m'lady.
Now Cora was even more curious. Please do, if there's something you feel I should know.
It's only that he wouldn't quite explain how he came to be at the front on that day, O'Brien said reluctantly. He's told us all along that he was working in a field hospital behind the lines and quite safe, doing all sorts of complicated medical work. Then all of a sudden he was at the front carrying a stretcher.
Cora hadn't really thought of it that way before.
Do you mean to suggest he wasn't telling the truth about his hospital work?
Perhaps, O'Brien said. Or, well, I'd wondered if he'd gotten into some sort of trouble that he was ashamed to tell us about. My brother, the one I told you about, my lady, tells me that they will often move a man into a more dangerous position if they feel he isn't reliable. If someone must be put at risk, it might as well be... He trailed off.
How is Paul? Cora asked. O'Brien's brother, her favorite one, she said, had been sent to a war hospital in London last year with nerve troubles.
They say he was recovered and sent him back, my lady.
Back to France?
Yes, my lady. Oh, O'Brien.
Cora turned to look at her, pulling her braid loose in the process.
I'm so sorry to hear that. I know it isn't what you were hoping for.
She'd been so relieved when her brother was sent home.
That's kind of you to say, my lady, she resumed braiding. But speaking of Thomas, it wouldn't be the first time he's made trouble for himself.
Well, if O'Brien didn't want to discuss her brother, Cora wouldn't pry any further. No, I suppose not. She'd speak to Dr. Clarkson about the matter, just to make sure he knew there was no obligation to keep Thomas on if it wasn't working out.
Can I have one of those?
Nurse Crawley asked. Thomas was sitting on the wall outside the hospital smoking a cigarette. He was fairly sure he'd heard somewhere that VAD girls were forbidden to smoke anywhere except, if they absolutely had to, their own rooms. But it seemed impolitic to say so. He opened a cigarette case, he'd started carrying it again since getting back to England, and angled it in her direction. "Thank you," she said, taking one. He passed her the lighter. Lighting it for her seemed a bit of a liberty. She lit it and inhaled expertly. Please don't tell them up at the house, she added. All the girls do it, but I don't think they'd understand.
Of course, Thomas said. He glanced over at her. She was pale and making an obvious effort to appear composed. Is he... She nodded. Private Dixon helped me move him. I just wanted to take a moment before I started laying him out. Probably a good idea. Did he regain awareness at all?
Not really. He called out for his mother a few times, but he was in delirium.
In the letter, you'll say that his last thoughts were of her, Thomas said. It was best to weave in as much of the truth as you could, kept the letters from all being the same, and made it easier to remember what you'd already said if they wrote back wanting more details.
And that he was comfortable and unafraid, she said with a nod. Cousin Isabel told me.
Yeah, you always say that. And I'd put in that you were with him the whole time and you volunteered to stay past your shift because you felt close to him. That helps if they know he wasn't alone and that he was special to the person who was with him.
That was what Jessup had said anyway when Thomas had had to answer letters from the wives and mothers and sisters of men he watched die.
I wasn't in love with him,
Nurse Crawley pointed out. Then don't say you were, Thomas answered. But it doesn't do anyone any harm if they get the idea you might have been.
She considered that for a moment. No, I suppose it doesn't.
A few hours later, they were walking toward the house with Thomas fervently hoping that no one from the household, upstairs or down, would see them. Nurse Crawley had seemed to take for granted that they would walk back together, even lingering while he finished briefing the others on his cases, so that they'd leave at the same time.
She still wants you reason about Nurse Whibley, Nurse Crawley was saying, even after this.
Thomas made a non-committal sound. Someone, he thought, ought to tell her quite frankly to drop it. She'd already gone further than anyone else would have gotten away with in terms of questioning her superior's decisions. But surely it could be someone other than him. Miss Whibley has her uses, he pointed out mildly. Sister Crawley had, as she'd hinted earlier, kept Nurse Whibley on duties where her out-of-date practices couldn't do any harm.
That's what Cousin Isabel says,
Nurse Crawley said. Sister Crawley, Thomas thought but did not say. That was the problem right there. In the family, Lady Sybil outranked Cousin Isabel. In the hospital, Nurse Crawley most emphatically did not outrank Sister Crawley. She sighed and continued, "But I have an idea what to do next." "Oh?"
"Yes, I'll talk to Mamma."
"Oh, Christ!" "Why's that?" he asked, hoping the answer would be something he hadn't thought of.
"She's on the hospital board," Nurse Crawley reminded him. "If she agrees that Nurse Whibley has got to go, that'll be that."
That was what he'd been afraid of. "I see." He ought to just let her do it. What was it to him if the rest of the hospital got wind of it and thought she was acting like a spoilt child? One way or another, he'd be gone in a month. But Jessup and the ward master had steered him clear of a few missteps, and Lady Sybil's never done anything to him. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" he asked.
"Why wouldn't it be?"
"Because Major Clarkson already thinks people named Crawley have too much to say about how he runs his hospital," Thomas thought. He'd heard a thing or two on the subject from the other orderlies. "The acting ward sister and the chief medical officer are responsible for that sort of thing," he said instead.
"But they're making a mistake."
"No one cares if you think they're making a mistake," Thomas carefully did not say. "You're in the army now."
But that thought gave him an idea.
"You might try asking his lordship what he thinks," he suggested.
"Papa? He doesn't have anything to do with the hospital."
"No, but he knows how things are done in the army," Thomas explained. "They told you that you're honorary officers, didn't they?"
She nodded. "Yes, but Papa won't see it that way. He still thinks of me as a little girl."
"So will everyone else if you run to your mamma about this." "Perhaps you could ask him what advice he'd give a junior officer in this situation. Say if Mr. Matthew had lost confidence in the officer above him, thought he was making dangerous decisions, that sort of thing."
"The senior officer is Nurse Whibley?" she asked.
"Yes," Thomas said and continued. "He's talked about it with the next officer up the chain, that's acting ward Sister Crawley, but he doesn't feel he's taking it seriously enough. What would his lordship suggest Mr. Matthew do?" Thomas felt fairly sure that he would tell Mr. Matthew to keep his lip buttoned.
"I suppose that might work," she said slowly, "if I put it to him that way."
"It might," Thomas agreed. There, no one could say he hadn't tried, or that he'd overstepped himself.
"Papa?"
It was Sybil standing at the doorway to the library in her nursing uniform. "Yes?" Robert asked. She looked tired, he thought. "I hope they aren't working you too hard down there."
"Oh, no," she said, coming into the room and sitting down. I enjoy it. Well, enjoy isn't quite the word, I suppose. Last night I sat up with a young man who was dying. No one would enjoy that. But it feels more important than anything I've ever done. Robert remembered feeling that way about his army duties when he'd been her age. It seemed so much more real and pressing than his duty to the estate, which at that time they'd expected to go to his elder brother in any case. Strange to think of having that in common with a young girl.
But if it does become too much for you, you'll say.
It won't, she answered. But there is something I wanted to ask you about as a fellow officer, sort of.
All right,
Robert said, careful to betray no amusement at the notion of his daughter as a fellow officer. She was, after all, serving her country in uniform. More than he was, if he was being honest about it. It's about another of the nurses at the hospital, not a VAD. She was a private duty nurse before the war, so I suppose she outranks me, technically. If she was really in the army, there'd be no technically about it. Still, Robert began to get the sense that they were treading on familiar ground.
But you find it difficult to respect her,
he suggested. He'd certainly had more than one senior officer in his military career who presented that difficulty. Yes, Sybil said. That's just it. She doesn't understand modern medical practices, and a man has died because of it. In a fighting unit, an out-of-touch or incompetent officer could cause the deaths of many more men than just one, or at least be judged as having done so in the court of popular opinion.
Are you certain that she was to blame for the death?
She hesitated. Cousin Isabel says we can't be certain. So does Corporal Barrow. But he'd have had a chance at least if she hadn't refused to let us examine his wound. Robert was relieved to hear that the woman they were talking about wasn't Cousin Isabel.
So she made a decision that you disagree with, he said, but it wasn't flagrantly reckless or in complete disregard of the man's life.
It isn't just that I disagree, Sybil said. She was wrong.
Weren't they always? When I was in the army, properly in the army, I mean, a great many of my senior officers were wrong from time to time, he said. It sounds as though you've already talked it over with...
What was it Thomas had called her?
The acting ward sister. Is she this other nurse's superior officer as well?
Sybil nodded. Yes, she's in charge of all the nurses, but she's no help. She just says that Nurse Whibley is doing her best and she and Dr. Clarkson are keeping watch over her and things like that. Robert said. He knew from his days as a senior officer that that was the sort of thing one said to a junior officer who had complaints about his superiors, whether you intended to do anything further or not.
As a junior officer, he said, you can't really expect to be kept informed about disciplinary action against a senior officer. It may well be that Cousin Isabel and Dr. Clarkson have the matter in hand.
I hadn't thought of that, she admitted.
And you've talked to Corporal Barrow about it?
Robert asked. Perhaps this, or something to do with this, was the difficulty Bates had alluded to.
What does he say?
I have, she said. He says leave it to Cousin Isabel and Dr. Clarkson. Robert was relieved to hear that. It wouldn't precisely be unprecedented for Thomas to try to cause trouble for someone he'd taken a dislike to, but if he was involving Sybil in one of his feuds, that would be beyond the pale.
I see, he said. Well, in my experience, the NCOs often know more about what's going on in the regiment than the junior officers do.
I suppose he might, Sybil said. He's next in charge after Cousin Isabel, really, even though he technically isn't. That was very nearly the definition of a good NCO in a regiment heavy with green junior officers.
In that case, if he thinks the matter is under control, he may well be right.
But what if he isn't? What if I do nothing and someone else dies? At that, Robert was half tempted to tell her to stop working at the hospital. A girl her age shouldn't have to think about things like that. But plenty of young men her age were facing situations even more stark, leading men to their deaths. Sybil had chosen to serve her country, and that was an honorable thing for her to have done, even if it brought her into contact with things he would rather she not know of. What could he tell her?
Darling,
what would you tell Cousin Matthew? She added, if he was serving under an officer who was getting people killed? But that way the question had a straightforward answer, unlike when he'd been thinking of his youngest daughter dealing with matters of life and death.
I would tell him that he must be ready to lodge a form of protest if he receives orders that he believes recklessly and needlessly endanger his men, he said. And then if his protest is unsuccessful, to decide whether to carry them out or to risk being found in a state of mutiny."
Sybil went pale.
"I expect it's a bit different for nurses," Robert added gently, "but it is a very serious matter. When one joins the army, one makes a promise to respect the chain of command, whether one agrees with it or not, and even if a particular officer is difficult to respect, going back on that promise carries consequences."
She nodded jerkily. "I hadn't thought of asking Mamma to do something about her," she admitted, "because she's on the hospital board. I suppose that was childish of me."
"It was," Robert said frankly, "and I'm not sure it would have been possible, since the hospital is now under military authority. If you had succeeded, or even if you had tried, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Major Clarkson didn't want you working under him any longer."
"I wouldn't want that," Sybil said. "My work at the hospital means everything to me."
"Then you must accept that your role in the army is different from your role as a representative of this family," Robert told her. "Even though your work is here in this country where our family is so prominent and everyone knows you as Lady Sybil, I expect it was a bit easier for me, going to Sandhurst and then overseas with the regiment, where no one cared if I was Lord Robert at home or not. But there you have it."
"I see," she said. "You've given me a lot to think about."
"I should start," Robert suggested, "by asking the ward sister what to do if this Nurse Wibley gives you an order that you believe is dangerous."
"And that's all right?" she said. "To ask that?"
"Yes," Robert said. "It's nearly always all right to ask a senior officer what you should do in a given situation. What's not all right is telling them what they should do or attempting to get round them."
The latter wasn't entirely true. There were times when getting around a senior officer was the only thing to do, but it seemed best not to muddy the waters at this point. "I'll do that," Sybil said, standing up. "Thank you, Papa. I'm glad I asked you."
"I'm glad you asked me too,"
Robert said, surprising himself with his own frankness. A father of daughters, he'd often thought, seemed to grow less and less relevant to his children's lives as they got older. He and Matthew did sometimes have the sort of man-to-man talks he'd imagined having with a son, but it wasn't quite the same.
"Whatever made you think of consulting your old silly papa?"
"Corporal Barrow suggested it, actually," she said. "He said you'd know all about how they do things in the army." She kissed him on the cheek and added, "I'm off to bed. I'm on night duty again tonight." She was gone before Robert had a chance to point out that he and Cora had never agreed she could go on night duty. Well, it was only senior officers they discussed, not attempting to get round. Not Mamma's. "You were right," Nurse Crawley said as they started down the drive. Bates had informed Thomas that, as both of them were on night duty, he was now responsible for seeing that Lady Sybil wasn't ravished walking down to the village in the dark. As a result, he'd had to stand by the front door like a brat, waiting for her to come out. Fortunately, she hadn't been late.
About what?
He asked. "Talking to Papa. He said that if I had gone to Mamma about Nurse Wibley, I'd be disrespecting the chain of command, and Dr. Clarkson might not let me work at the hospital anymore." Thomas didn't think Major Clarkson would have gone that far. The war would end eventually, after all, and the Crawleys would still be here when it did. But he said,
"Yes, he might have."
"Why didn't you say so?" Thomas looked at her.
"Because you're Lady Sybil Crawley, and I'm a former footman."
"I don't care about things like that," Nurse Crawley said. Thomas didn't have the luxury of not caring about things like that.
"Really? You were ready to stick a ladyship on Nurse Wibley? None of the rest of us would have known who could be next."
"I never!"
she began indignantly.
"You almost did,"
Thomas interrupted.
"My lady."
He said it, as he'd once told Rollins, like a fucking pants. They walked on in silence for a moment, long enough for Thomas to start to wonder if he'd just made a grave error, until Nurse Crawley said, "You're right again. I didn't think about how it would seem to everyone else. Pax." "Pax," he agreed, not that he had a great deal of choice. When they reached the hospital, Nurse Crawley headed straight for Sister Crawley, so Thomas went to confer with the orderlies who'd been working on the wards during the day shift instead. Captain Prescott continued to do well, and there were no surprises with the other patients except that one, a Major Pettigrew, had been told by Major Clarkson to stay in bed, but felt he was more than well enough to be up and about.
"With any luck, he'll go to sleep and not give you a hard time,"
said Private Wells, who'd been looking after him during the day.
"Now you've gone and jinxed it,"
Thomas said.
"Look sharp,"
he added, noticing Sister Crawley heading their way. "Corporal Barrow," she said. Wells took the hint and scurried away.
Mum?
Thomas said.
One of the nurses has asked what they ought to do if Nurse Whibley gives them instructions that don't seem quite right, she said.
It wasn't too hard to guess which nurse that had been.
Yes, Mum?
I've said that they should ask me, or in my absence, you.
Yes, Mum.
Thomas said. The first part of that he had no issue with.
Just to be clear, you're instructing me to countermand Nurse Whibley if necessary.
If necessary, yes. I'll also be telling her not to give instructions to the other nurses without my approval, but
Nurse Whibley had been told the principles of modern wound care many times without it sinking in, so there was no telling whether she'd choose to remember this or not.
I see. Thank you, Mum.
it's a bit awkward, but I don't see what else we can do, really,
Sister Crawley added. Thomas wondered what they'd do when he left.
Yes, Mum.
Robert, Cora said, appearing in the doorway of his dressing room. Her tone boded nothing good, and besides that, she scarcely ever turned up in his dressing room unless there was something she urgently needed to discuss in private.
That'll be all, Bates,
he said quickly. She moved aside to let Bates exit, and Robert used the time to finish tying his white tie. Once he was gone, she asked,
"Why did I have to find out from O'Brien that Sybil has gone on night duty again?"
She spoke very quickly, as she did when she was angry.
"I meant to tell you that," Robert said. "But you were out, and then I was out, and then it was the dressing gone. Did you not feel I should be consulted?" "She didn't precisely consult me either," he said. "But I don't see how we can object if it's something they're all expected to do." "I thought that we were agreed on this," Cora said. He sighed. "We had a talk today, Sybil and I, about a difficulty she's having at the hospital. It made me realize—"
He wasn't sure precisely what he had realized.
"If she were a boy, she'd likely be over in France commanding a platoon."
Being out of the house at night in their own village was a small price to pay compared to that.
"She isn't a boy,"
Cora reminded him.
"She's our little girl." "And our little girl has volunteered to serve her king and country," Robert reminded her. "It would be quite wrong for us to ask that she be treated any differently from the other young ladies, and it would quite likely diminish her in the eyes of her—"
He hesitated over the word.
"Sister officers."
That really didn't sound right.
"And you've just decided this?" "We decided it when we agreed she could sign up as a nurse," Robert said. "We may not have entirely realized it, but imagine the state the army would be in if everyone's parents demanded a say in what duties they were assigned."
"We might be a great deal better off," Cora said darkly. And after a moment's reflection, "At least if the Germans did the same."
"She'll be all right," Robert said, shifting the subject. "It is a long way to go in the dark, but I've said she's to walk with Thomas."
Of course, if it was any other man, that wouldn't be a solution at all. Young girls and moonlit walks and young men all being what they were. But they both knew about Thomas.
It could be a lot worse,
Corporal Barrow said, gesturing with a sandwich. He and Sybil were in the patient's day room, having their tea break. Sybil was glad to see that Miss Patmore had sent something for him to eat as well, otherwise it would have been dreadfully awkward.
She could actually be in charge.
They were talking about Nurse Whibley, of course. He had a point. At least Cousin Isabel, Sister Crawley, she should think of her on duty, was sensible. Corporal Barrow went on.
At the base hospital in France, the VAD nurse was working under a ward sister who wouldn't let her do dressing changes without supervision. She didn't like orderlies either. It was a right mess when all the wounded from the Psalms started turning up. The man next to me had a dressing that hadn't been changed in days. The sister had hundreds of patients to look after, you see, and it was going septic.
Hadn't he been at a dressing station? Sybil thought that was what Anna had said. What did you do?
Well, I just started doing the dressing change. He shrugged. Didn't want him losing the leg, and I figured there wasn't much they could do to me, as I was a patient.
Oh, of course. He would have been sent to a base hospital when he was wounded. He continued.
Then the VAD decided to help, which was a good thing since I couldn't use my left hand at the time. She might have gotten in trouble, but luckily the chief medical officer saw things the right way.
Sybil thought of what Papa had said about dangerous orders and risking being found in a state of mutiny.
That was lucky.
He nodded.
I doubt they do anything too dreadful to nurses, but I expect they might have sent her home.
Being sent home in disgrace seemed dreadful enough to Sybil, though she supposed it wouldn't seem to someone who had been at the front and been wounded. She sounds like someone I'd quite like to know.
You might, Corporal Barrow said. Pretty sure she's one of your lot. Fortescue.
Not Vera Fortescue, Sybil said. Then she realized, oh, no, it couldn't be. She's not old enough. You had to be 23 to even apply for a posting abroad, and Vera was about her age. They'd been presented at court at the same time.
Corporal Barrow shook his head. Harriet, though you didn't hear it from me, we're not meant to be on Christian name terms with nurses.
Vera's elder sister, Sybil said. She'd come out with Mary. Or else Edith. I don't really know her, but we've met. It had been at some ball or other during her season.
Shouldn't be surprised if you run into her again, Corporal Barrow said, once this is all over.
She very well might, Sybil realized, though it was difficult to imagine going to a London ball and talking to someone who had nursed in France. It was almost as difficult to imagine going to a London ball again, full stop. Do you suppose things will just go back to how they were when it's all over?
Corporal Barrow shrugged. I suppose they must.
I don't see how, Sybil said, or how she'd survive it if they did. Paying calls and going to dress fittings and all the rest of it had seemed stifling before, when she didn't have anything to compare it to, when going down to dinner in trousers in her own family's house had seemed the height of daring.
Me neither, but none of us would have foreseen this.
His vague gesture encompassed the two of them, the hospital, and perhaps the entire war. It'll have to be different, Sybil said, because we'll all be different. We can't go on being the same after everything we've seen and done.
No, I don't suppose we can, Corporal Barrow said, gathering up the sandwich wrappings. But that doesn't mean anything else will change.
We'll make a change, she answered. All of us, I mean. The whole generation. Some of the magazines had started calling them that. It seemed thrilling and important.
Maybe, said Corporal Barrow, but I'll wager there are plenty in our generation who like things just fine the way they were and can't wait for everything to get back to normal.
He had a point. Mary, for instance, was one of them. She often spoke of the war as if its primary significance was interrupting her courtship with Cousin Matthew. But it can't be most of us, she said. Especially not among the women, not after we've seen what it's like to do things, important things. I can't go back to being just an ornament.
Corporal Barrow gave her a steady look, then finally said, Best get back to work.
Sybil had the distinct impression she'd offended him, although she wasn't sure how.
I suppose it sounded a bit silly what I said about not wanting to go back to the way things were before the war, Nurse Crawley said as they walked back up to the house in the morning. I know my own life, is very easy compared to other people's.
It is, Thomas thought, but said instead, I've never found that helps much. Other people having it worse, I mean. For instance, anybody who's lost a limb would be glad to have my wound. So would quite a few men still in France, for that matter. I know that, but I still don't feel lucky.
Yes, Nurse Crawley said. That's just it. One feels guilty for not appreciating one's circumstances, but that's not quite the same thing as truly appreciating them.
She sighed. I thought it was interesting what you said about not wanting to go back to being an ornament, Thomas said, because he had. What had bothered him about it was the fact that she might actually have the choice in the matter. Being a footman's a bit like that, really. I once told somebody, a friend of mine in France, it's like your wallpaper. You're always on display, but nobody's really meant to notice you. It was looked at one way, an astonishingly impertinent thing for him to be saying. But he wasn't wallpaper at the moment, and Nurse Crawley wasn't an ornament at the moment. Fortunately, she didn't take offense.
I never quite thought of it that way, she admitted. I suppose if you're wallpaper, we must be paintings. My sisters and me, I mean, even Mamma. Being a painting may have some advantages over being wallpaper, but I doubt it's any more interesting.
It wasn't apt comparison, Thomas thought. Downton's paintings were certainly more valuable than its wallpaper, but when you got down to it, both were just hanging there on a wall, watching life go by. No, I don't imagine it would be. It was a strange thought. Lady Sybil, one of the family, feeling just as stifled in the house as he did. They walked on for a bit.
I'm not sure I mind the part about not being noticed, Nurse Crawley said. It seems as though all I've heard since leaving the nursery is how being the daughter of an earl means that all eyes are upon me, and I must not do anything to cause comment.
Oh, wallpaper can't get away with anything either, Thomas said. That wasn't quite true. He couldn't imagine any of the young ladies sneaking off to dens of iniquity while the family was in London, for instance.
If you've ever in your life noticed a piece of wallpaper, it'll have been because there was something wrong with it. That's true, said Nurse Crawley. I was just thinking, in fact, about the wallpaper in the room I stayed in at my nursing course. There was a piece behind the door that was hung upside down. Once I noticed it, I couldn't look around the room without my eye being drawn to it. Thomas nodded. A painting that's upside down. Now that might be that the artist was doing something too modern and interesting for the average person to understand. Upside down wallpaper is just a mistake. She laughed. I suppose. But Mamma and Papa don't want me to be interesting and modern, I'm afraid. Thomas wondered if that really mattered. If she could, if she were brave enough, decide that it didn't. Perhaps not. He supposed there to be obstacles to an earl's daughter making a different kind of life, though he didn't know what they might be exactly. Before he could decide whether to risk the impertinence of asking, she said, Do you know, Nurse Fairchild was set to go up to Oxford when the war started. I'd never known anyone before who even thought of going to university. Any woman, I mean. For the second time in this conversation, Thomas thought of Rouse, what he'd said about having to have a schoolmaster take an interest in him before he could even think of going to secondary school and so on. Nurse Fairchild was the curate's daughter. Would it have been any easier for her? How'd she manage that? Well, she's frightfully clever, Nurse Crawley said, and her parents sent her to a modern sort of girls' school. They did Latin. But she had to have a lot of extra tutoring in that after she left school and learn Greek from scratch before she could take the entrance examinations. You have to know both, even if you're reading a modern subject. She sighed. I don't think going to university is what I want, really, but if it were, I'd be miles behind. We only ever learnt French and dancing and things like that. And I'd have no hope of catching up if Mamma and Papa discouraged it. They'd just have to be paid, for one thing. I see, Thomas said. Nurse Fairchild might not have needed quite as much luck as Rouse, but it didn't sound as though it had been easy. I'm not sure what I do want, if not university, but whatever it is, there will be all sorts of details like that to be worked out. Yes, of course, tutors wanting paying was a detail. She went on. Making a change is much more complicated than I thought back before the war when I was helping Gwen become a secretary. Do you remember Gwen? Of course, said Thomas. She's the one that got away. I expect she thought I was silly too, telling her that her dream would come true if she wanted it enough. I understand now it takes more than that. You've got to have a plan and resources, money and things, and someone who can give you a leg up, like Cousin Isabel getting me into the nursing course. She sighed again, which brings me right back around to being luckier than other people. What about you? What would you like to do after the war? Nurse Crawley might understand more now than she had before the war, but she clearly didn't understand enough if she thought he'd even have bothered thinking about what he'd like to do after the war. With my arm the way it is, I'll have to consider myself lucky if I can get another place as a servant, he said with as much patience as he could manage. She looked puzzled. But you managed quite well in the hospital. In the hospital, he said grimly. Nobody cares how it looks when I'm carrying things. Oh, she said. Yes. Thomas knew he ought to press on the subject. If he could get her to understand, she might help, as she had helped Gwen. They'd need footmen at Downton again, for one thing. But asking for help being a footman again so he wouldn't starve to death felt a lot like asking to be slapped in the face in the hopes he could avoid a kick in the balls. And he did have at least a month before he'd find out if the army was kicking him out. He could afford a bit of delay before he started groveling. I expect I'll think of something, he said instead, as lightly as he could. I always do. Miss Hughes was in her sitting room going over some household accounts when there was a ferocious crash from the next room. Quickly she put down her pen and got up to see what on earth was going on. Going out into the passage, she saw that Miss O'Brien's attention had also been attracted by the commotion. Fortunately, most of the others were elsewhere, beginning the day's tasks. Otherwise, there would likely be a stampede. At Miss Hughes's quelling glare, Miss O'Brien withdrew back into the servants' hall. She opened the door to the storage area next to her room and found Thomas with his back to the door, holding a silver serving tray awkwardly in his left hand. At the sound of the door opening, he turned, causing the tray to slip, and swore, rather shockingly. Miss Hughes was not sure she had ever heard that particular word spoken aloud, as a matter of fact. Certainly not in this house. Thomas, she said. Language! He got the tray in his right hand and said,
I'm sorry, Miss Hughes. I'm afraid I picked up some bad habits in the army.
See that you lose them as quickly as possible, she said.
It was lucky Mr. Carson was up in the servery dealing with the breakfast things.
What in heaven's name are you doing?
Just, seeing how my shoulder's coming along, he said. Not as well as I'd hoped, I'm afraid.
I see, she said. She'd wondered herself if he'd be up to serving at table should the occasion arise. Perhaps next time you decide to experiment, you could use one of the wooden trays.
He flushed. Yes, Miss Hughes, I didn't think of that. He gave the tray a little polish with the sleeve of his uniform and put it back on the shelf where it belonged.
Well, never mind it now, she said, beckoning him out of the room. Has the army said anything then about what's going to happen?
Thomas glanced up the passageway toward the servants' hall and Miss O'Brien. She gestured him into her sitting room. Once inside, he said,
No, I wouldn't expect to hear anything until my medical panel. It hasn't been scheduled yet.
Why he'd worry about anyone overhearing that, Miss Hughes had no idea, unless there was more that he wasn't saying. Anna had hinted that he might have made some sort of a mistake down at the hospital. Perhaps he hadn't been told anything officially, but had reason to expect they wouldn't keep him on.
Do you have a sense of how it might turn out?
She asked, gesturing for him to sit by the fire. He did so with a sigh.
Not really. Major Clarkson said when I got here that I wasn't to expect him to do me any favors on my medical panel. I have shown I can manage most of the work, so I'm hoping that'll help, but, well, I suppose it could go either way.
He managed a pained-looking smile. That didn't sound terribly optimistic to Miss Hughes. If he was dismissed from the army, invalided out, she'd heard Mr. Bates call it, and he wasn't ready to serve at table, Mr. Carson would fuss. But he'd likely fuss no matter what, and once William was called up, he ought to consider himself fortunate to have a footman at all.
Well, a lot can happen in a month, she said bracingly.
Yes, Miss Hughes,
he said dully. For a moment she was reminded of how he'd been just after poor Mr. Fitzroy's death, like all the life had been drained out of him.
It's not as bad as all that, she reminded him.
He nodded.
I know. I was just telling someone. I have to count myself lucky I still have the arm.
Then he ducked his head and muttered something she couldn't quite make out about Mr. Bates.
I'm sorry?
I said I wish I hadn't given Bates such a hard time about his leg, he repeated more distinctly. I didn't really think about it being hard to find a place when you've got to ask them to make allowances for you, even if you can do most of the job.
Miss Hughes couldn't deny that he'd been beastly about the matter, nor could she be sorry he'd learned the error of his ways. But she did wish the lesson hadn't quite been this hard.
You might tell him that,
she suggested.
He gave her a skeptical look.
He has warmed up to you a bit, now that you and Anna are friends,
she pointed out gently. It seemed fruitless to attempt to explain that their rivalry had always loomed much larger in Thomas's mind than in Mr. Bates's. She'd once heard Thomas refer to Mr. Bates as his arch-nemesis, and she didn't think he'd entirely been joking.
I expected it'd be more useful to bury the hatchet with Miss O'Brien, he said. Not that there's much chance of that.
She seemed a bit worried when we were all wondering whether you were still alive, Miss Hughes said.
If she was, she's gotten over it.
He leaned back in his chair and took out his cigarettes. She cleared her throat and he sat up straight, putting them back in his pocket.
Sorry, forgot where I was for a moment there. He stood up. If we've finished, I should probably be getting to bed.
Yes, of course, she said.
It really was a good thing he'd remembered where he was, Thomas thought, going out into the courtyard and lighting a cigarette. He'd been thinking about how he wouldn't really mind mending fences with O'Brien. Of the friends he'd had before 1914, she was the only one left alive. But that wasn't the sort of thing he ought to be saying to Miss Hughes, or to anyone here. Even having her know that he'd been checking whether he'd be able to serve at table, or worse yet, the results of that experiment, had him feeling a little itchy. She was quite wrong that anything might change with his arm in a month, or ever, probably, but he'd managed not to say that either. If they thought his incapacity was only temporary, perhaps they'd all get used to it somehow before they realized that it wasn't. He could always pretend he'd thought it was going to get better. It was times like these he missed the wardmaster. If Thomas were still at the 47th, he'd have some sense, as Miss Hughes had put it, of how it might turn out. He'd thought a few times about asking Major Clarkson,
or Sister Crawley on the theory that Clarkson might have said something to her. But they were liable to think he was asking for the special treatment he'd already been promised he wouldn't get. At the 47th, the Wardmaster would likely have already figured out how to make it come out all right. For a moment, Thomas idly considered writing to him, on the off chance there was something he could do, but it didn't seem likely that even his reach would extend from a dressing station in France to a medical panel in Yorkshire. And Thomas knew how it turned out when you asked for too much. None of that had precisely put him in a frame of mind for a restful day's sleep, Thomas thought, stubbing out a cigarette. He wandered into the kitchen to see if a cup of tea could be had. His quest was successful, so that was at least one thing going right. And he took it into the servants' hall. O'Brien was at one end of the table, and Anna, come down from supervising the housemaids at the morning cleaning to do some mending, it looked like, at the other. Thomas sat at Anna's end. "What are you doing still up?" she asked him.
"Feeling restless,"
He answered.
"I shouldn't wonder,"
said O'Brien. "What could you be on about now?"
"How was that, Miss O'Brien?"
he asked.
"Only that her ladyship's gone down to the village to talk to Dr. Glasson about the troubles they've been having at the hospital." Thomas suddenly felt bone-weary. No cure was quite as effective for not wanting to go to bed as finding out there was a problem you had to solve before you could. He might be able to hand this one off fairly easily, though. Anna had put down her sewing and was looking at him with concern. Careful to appear unruffled, Thomas told O'Brien, "I'd be surprised if she didn't speak to him from time to time, being on the hospital board." Turning to Anna, he said, "Would now be a good time to look at that thing I was telling you about?"
There was no such thing, of course, but fortunately Anna caught on. "Yes, I have a minute," she said. They ducked into the boot room.
"Right,"
Thomas said, closing the door behind them.
"Is Lady Sybil still up?"
"Thomas," Anna said warningly. Right, he supposed it wasn't entirely delicate inquiring into a young lady's sleeping habits. He moved on.
"She'll want to hear about that. Even if she's gone up, I expect you can make some excuse."
Anna was looking at him in disbelief.
"To do with her clothes or something,"
Thomas elaborated. The look of disbelief didn't fade. Apparently that wasn't the part of the problem she was having difficulty with.
"Only we've just got it sorted, the troubles O'Brien was talking about. If it's to do with that patient that Nurse Crawley was upset about, I mean. Her ladyship going down there and stirring it up again, it's not going to look good."
"Sorted? How?" Anna asked suspiciously.
"Rather neatly, if I do say so myself,"
Thomas said.
Nurse Crawley, I mean, was thinking of asking her ladyship to intervene. I couldn't tell her myself what a bad idea that would be, as she wasn't taking a hint, but I thought of suggesting she ask his lordship's advice. They had a talk about how junior officers don't get to choose their superiors.
Anna scoffed. Thomas wasn't sure why.
"Well, they don't,"
Thomas said.
"and if she wants to be treated like anyone else, that sort of thing isn't going to help."
"But you want Lady Sybil's superior," Anna said with excessive patience.
"Of course I'm not, but Nurse Whibley is, unfortunately."
"Who's Nurse Whibley?" Had her name never come up.
"The one Nurse Crawley blames for the whole thing. She's a registry nurse. They automatically outrank the VADs.
Anna looked puzzled. "You mean it wasn't—" She cut herself off abruptly, but Thomas suddenly realized what she'd been about to say. What she'd been thinking all this time. Why, he'd noticed a hint of disapproval every time the subject came up.
"Right,"
he said, his own voice sounding muffled and distant to his ears.
"It wasn't me." "Thomas, that is what you thought, isn't it?" "I suppose I never said otherwise. Did I think I had to? I forgot that anything that goes wrong anywhere near me is always my fault. How stupid of me."
Before Anna could try to explain how he'd gotten it wrong, or rather how he couldn't possibly blame her for getting it wrong, he about-faced and left, shutting the door hard behind him. Let Nurse Crawley, Lady Sybil, whoever she was, sort out her own problems. After Thomas stormed off, Anna tried to collect her thoughts. She was sure that neither of them, Thomas or Lady Sybil, had mentioned this Whibley person before. They just said someone. Why had she assumed it was Thomas? Well, the fact that Thomas seemed to care about the matter, for one thing. He didn't generally talk about problems unless he was trying to wriggle his way out of one. Or he hadn't, at any rate. Since coming back from the war, he'd talked to her about things like missing his friends, wishing he could go back to France, and worrying the army wouldn't keep him on. Things she couldn't possibly do anything about. But this time he had asked her to do something. Just not for him. It really wasn't any wonder she'd gotten the wrong idea. Surely he'd see that if he just thought about it reasonably. How was she to guess that he, of all people, was trying to keep Lady Sybil out of trouble? If she pointed that out, though, he'd likely accuse her again of blaming him for everything that went wrong. She had a good reason for thinking he was the one to blame for what had happened to that poor lieutenant, with Miss Crawley being dragged out of her bed to deal with it and everything else. Though at the moment, she couldn't remember precisely what everything else was, just that there were a lot of hints pointing in that direction. Hadn't Miss O'Brien said... Before she could complete that thought, the door opened.
Everything all right?
Mr. Bates asked. I'm afraid I've been a bit stupid, she confessed. And unkind.
Is this to do with Thomas?
Mr. Bates asked.
Miss O'Brien said you'd had a row.
Of course she had, Anna said with a sigh and brought him up to date, concluding, I was just realizing that it was Miss O'Brien who put the idea in my head that he was the one to blame. I don't know why I never thought to question it.
Mr. Bates said, nodding. I suppose I thought even she might lay off him after everything that's happened.
He's right that Lady Sybil will want to know if her ladyship is all set to interfere, Anna added. I'd best go up and tip her off, as he said. Though I admit it's difficult to get my head round. Him trying to keep her out of trouble.
And COs are meant to keep junior officers out of trouble,
Mr. Bates explained.
It's part of the job.
He shook his head.
I don't think I'd have ever thought to send her to his lordship for a man-to-man talk. But somehow it doesn't surprise me that he did think of it.
It didn't really surprise Anna either. They parted ways, she racing upstairs to Lady Sybil's room. Lady Sybil was just getting into bed as she arrived. I'm sorry, my lady, Anna said. I didn't realize you'd gone up. I just came to collect your uniform. That's all right, Lady Sybil said. I'm not really tired. I suppose I haven't got the knack of sleeping during the day yet. I expect it's difficult, Anna said, stalling for time. On the way up here, she'd thought of her excuse for coming in, but not how she'd introduced her real reason. Everything all topsy-turvy? A bit, but I can't grumble. Everyone takes a turn on night duty. At least Papa understands that, she added in an undertone, implying that her ladyship didn't. Perhaps Miss O'Brien had given them the wrong idea about the purpose of her ladyship's visit to the hospital, and wouldn't put it past her. But she supposed that Lady Sybil would want to know about that too, if she wanted to be treated like anyone else. Oh dear, she said. What is it? Lady Sybil asked, sitting up. I probably shouldn't say, my lady, but Miss O'Brien mentioned that her ladyship plans to speak to Dr. Clarkson today. Lady Sybil threw the covers aside and got out of bed. Oh, drat! She can't go and interfere, not when I've just settled the other thing. She went to the chair and retrieved the day dress she'd changed into for breakfast, shucking her nightgown and pulling the dress over her head. Would you help me put my hair up? It'd be quicker if you do it. Lady Sybil had gotten into the habit of doing her own hair while she was away on the nursing course, but it sometimes took her more than one try to get it to stay up and not look lopsided. Of course. Lady Sybil sat down at the dressing table, and Anna got to work on her hair. It could well be something else that her ladyship plans to discuss with Dr. Clarkson, my lady, she said. Miss O'Brien was mysterious on the subject, as is her way. Let's hope so, said Lady Sybil grimly, but I'd best find out. Thomas was sitting by his bedroom window, boots up on the windowsill, angrily smoking, when there was a knock on the door. What? He snapped. The door opened slightly, and he looked over his shoulder. Are you decent? Anna asked. What are you doing up here? Thomas asked. Well, it was no business of his if she wanted to get sacked for being in a man's bedroom. I wanted to talk to you, she explained, coming the rest of the way in, and ignoring that he hadn't answered her question. Fortunately, he'd only gotten as far as unbuttoning his tunic. He supposed she could stand the sight of his undershirt. Not sure I want to talk to you, he said. It reminded him a bit of the time Rollins had come bothering him when he'd wanted to be alone. Let's not tell Anna to fuck off. She was unlikely to take it as well as Rollins had. I wanted to say I was sorry. You're right. I did assume that the problem at the hospital had something to do with you. It's not an excuse, but Miss O'Brien was saying it must have been, and, Well, I shouldn't have paid her any mind. I'm not sure why I did. O'Brien. Of course.
And how would she know anything about it?
Anna sat down on the edge of his bed. Honestly, had it slipped her mind, she was in a man's bedroom and said, She told us about Miss Crowley having to come to the hospital the night it all started. And since then, she'd just been hinting she knows things the rest of us don't. You know how she does.
I do,
Thomas said grimly. So did she.
Sister Crawley had to be sent for that night because the patient needed an operation and Major Clarkson wanted her to assist in theater. None of us who were on duty had done it before.
Oh, Anna said.
I expect I could have managed, but if it's not an absolute screaming emergency, they'd like you to at least see a thing done once before you try it.
I suppose they would, Anna said. And what about another thing she said about Lady Sybil being asked to stay the next night?
She wasn't asked. She volunteered, Thomas said. It's standard procedure for a deathbed to have somebody sit with him, if somebody can be spared for it.
If there wasn't an extra person available, you checked on them as often as possible.
Then after that, Nurse Fairchild's turn on night duty ended. They do a week at a time. I'm not sure why they decided Nurse Crawley would take it next. She might have asked to, or it might have been Nurses Wibley's turn.
Thomas didn't pay a great deal of attention to the nurse's duty schedule.
Is there anything else you'd like me to explain?
He asked with some asperity.
Anna bit her lip.
There's one more thing she's saying. Why wouldn't there be?
And what's that?
It's to do with your wound, she said.
Oh, that. I'm not making it up. Bates has seen it. So has Major Clarkson. Not to mention all the doctors and nurses between here and the front.
It isn't that, she said. I mean, she did try to suggest something like that when you first came back, but no one paid him any mind. So she'd come up with something else. Typical.
What is it then?
She's been hinting. Please don't bark at me. I'm not the one who's saying it. But she's been hinting that if they relied on you so much at the dressing station, it's a bit funny they'd send you to the front on that day.
Thomas's blood went cold. That's not true, he said.
I didn't say it was.
It isn't.
They sent Rouse to the front because they wanted to get rid of him, but it wasn't like that with Thomas. The wardmaster had sent him because he was good in no man's land and at field triage. What had he said? He needed somebody who could use his fucking head. That was why he'd sent Thomas.
It wasn't meant to be the worst day of the entire bloody war, he added. It was meant to be the day we started winning.
Though the wardmaster hadn't believed that. He'd known it was going to be bad. He'd sent Thomas because he'd known it was going to be bad, and then he'd sent him away. Had he? No, of course not. He hadn't had a choice, not really. Sybil raced downstairs, hoping Mamma hadn't left yet. After picking up a hint from Carson, who was in the front hall, she found her in the drawing room writing a letter. Mamma? Oh, Sybil, I thought you'd gone home. I was just about to, she said, but someone mentioned you were going to talk to Dr. Clarkson today. Yes, she said. Why? Is there something you'd like me to bring to his attention? No, Sybil answered, relieved. I thought... You don't mind about me being on night duty, then? Your father doesn't, Mamma said. He said you had quite a talk yesterday. We did. She hesitated. In fact, we talked about how, if there were anything I was concerned about, it would be quite wrong of me to go to, well, a member of the board in hopes of getting round Dr. Clarkson and Cousin Isabel. Mamma gave Sybil one of her skeptical looks. Like if Cousin Matthew asked Papa to come between him and his commanding officer, Sybil added. That wouldn't be at all suitable. I don't see why not, if there was something he could do, Mamma said. But as it happens, the matter I wanted to speak to Dr. Clarkson about isn't to do with you at all. Oh, that set Sybil back on her heels a bit. Of course, with Mamma being on the hospital board, there were any number of reasons she might talk to Dr. Clarkson without it having to do with Sybil. But is it about Miss Wibley? Because if it is, they might still think I put you up to it. No, Mamma said. As a matter of fact, I wanted to ask him how Thomas is working out. Oh, Sybil said, vastly relieved. That's all right, then. It wasn't as though Dr. Clarkson could have any complaints about Corporal Barrow. I'm glad you approve. Barrow? Clarkson said. Out of all the reasons he thought Lady Grantham might be insisting on speaking with him, that one hadn't even made the list. He's doing well. I'm glad to hear it, Lady Grantham said. I didn't want you to feel that the family wanted you to keep him on if he wasn't working out. It hadn't even occurred to Clarkson until she raised the possibility. The two nurses Crawley he knew he was stuck with whether he wanted them or not. And, on balance, he did, even at the cost of increased interference from the family. But he wouldn't have expected them to concern themselves with a farmhouse footman. Although he'd not have expected the Dowager Countess to maneuver him into lying to keep Mr. Molesley and young William out of the war either. Perhaps this was the same sort of thing, or perhaps Lady Grantham had, wonder of wonders, realized how inappropriate it was of the Dowager to have made that request, and wanted to assure him it wasn't going to happen again. My role in his medical panel is limited, Clarkson said, but I shouldn't worry about him being sent back to France. It'll be either home service or medical discharge. He's aware of this. I see. That didn't seem to be the answer she was looking for. Perhaps she was wondering which it would be. With William bound for the army sooner or later, they could well be left without a footman. It didn't seem like a calamity to him. They'd still have as many maids as they wanted, but he supposed they might see it differently. The Dowager certainly had. I'm afraid I can't say how it will go. I won't know myself until the panel meets. That was skirting quite close to an untruth. Clarkson had just about decided that if the RAMs they didn't need Barrow elsewhere, he'd suggest posting him at the Downton Hospital. If he said as much to the other members of the panel, they'd not be likely to recommend medical discharge, even if they had been leaning that way otherwise. He'd quite like to hang on to Barrow, because the War Office was in the habit of sending him brand new orderlies and VADs and then reassigning them to somewhere busier as soon as they'd begun to get their feet under them. That was why he had to be grateful for the senior nurse Crawley, although he could have done with being challenged less often. Having an experienced NCO on hand had improved things no end. But the last thing he wanted to do was give anyone from the big house the idea he could fix a medical panel. I understand, her ladyship said. Well, now that that's settled, I was also wondering about the young ladies on night duty, not just Lady Sybil. I'm sure the other girls' parents would have questions too, if they knew. Perhaps you could explain how you make sure that everything's proper. Now that had been on the list. It was unusually subtle of her ladyship to have opened with something else. Certainly. The voluntary aid detachment advises us on these matters. So Mamma said she only wanted to ask Dr. Clarkson about you, Nurse Crawley explained as they walked to the hospital that evening. About him? Damn it! That meant O'Brien's rumors had reached the family. It ought to turn out all right, since he had not, in fact, done anything. But would it? What if being asked specifically if he was a problem led Major Clarkson to think differently of something he hadn't even noticed at the time? Thomas couldn't think of anything he'd done wrong, but God knew that didn't matter. Oblivious to the effect her comment had had on her audience, Nurse Crawley continued. Still, I'm glad Anna thought to tell me. It could easily have been something quite different. She didn't see why I shouldn't have asked her to intervene about Nurse Whibley. Aware that politeness demanded a response, Thomas dredged up something about her ladyship had never been in the army, and could it be expected to understand how these things worked? I suppose not. I didn't understand either until Papa explained it to me. Perhaps I should ask him to make her understand. It wasn't a bad idea. And could he get away with suggesting she not interfere in Thomas's life either? Well, no, he couldn't go that far, but to be honest, I could have done without her ladyship going and reminding the Major my status there isn't exactly official. Nurse Crawley glanced over at him. I didn't think of that. I wouldn't worry about it, he continued. It's just with my medical panel coming up. Surely they'll keep you on, Nurse Crawley said. Things have been going much more smoothly since you started. Thomas said. He hadn't really thought about the possibility that if the medical panel went the way he wanted, they might have him do his home service here. He supposed that would be all right. If he was working there officially, they'd billet him somewhere, and he didn't mind working at the hospital. It was living on sufferance up at the Abbey that was the problem. It's true, Nurse Crawley said. Cousin Isabel's mentioned it. In that case, Thomas wished she'd mentioned it to her ladyship in order to countermand O'Brien's calumnies. That's good to hear. When they reached the hospital, Sister Crawley briefed him on his cases, finishing up. And Lieutenant Hurston's been having a difficult time, she went on. We've reduced his morphine, you'll see it on his chart, and as a result, he's had to begin coming to terms with the loss of his leg. If he has trouble sleeping, he's allowed an extra half dose. But if you are terribly busy, you might try talking with him a bit. That sort of thing was, as Thomas had pointed out earlier, not his area, but she continued. He'll be going to one of the orthopedic hospitals for rehabilitation and eventually fitting of a prosthetic limb. You can give him some idea of what to expect. He seems to be the sort who'd prefer solid facts to commiseration.
I see,
Thomas said. That was something he could handle.
I'll do my best.
Lieutenant Hurston did indeed have trouble sleeping. Thomas planned the medication round so that he'd reach Hurston at the end of it, and asked if his leg was troubling.
The MO is authorized to touch more morphine if you fancy it, sir.
Oh, that's all right. It's not my leg, really. It's more the idea of my leg, if that makes sense.
It does, sir,
Thomas said, sitting down in a chair someone had left at Hurston's bedside.
Cigarette?
That I'll take you up on,
he said, and lit it.
I shouldn't grumble. I know there's plenty worse off than me, but I can't help thinking about my fiancée. I'll release her from her obligation, of course, but if I know her, she won't have it. She's such a lovely, vibrant girl. I can't bear thinking of how it'll wear her down being tied to a cripple year after year.
It may not be as bleak as you're picturing it, sir, Thomas offered. I spent some time at the London Orthopedic Hospital, a shoulder wound, and they're able to do quite a bit for the ones who lost a leg.
Hurston gave him a skeptical look.
The nurse said I'd get a wooden one. Do those really do you any good?
Yes, sir. It takes practice to learn to walk with one, but nearly everyone manages it.
Well, if she won't be pushing me around in a bath chair, that's something,
Hurston said.
And your amputation was below the knee, wasn't it?
Thomas asked.
He nodded. They all say that if you must have an amputation, that's the kind to have. Keeping the knee makes a big difference. The physiotherapists encourage the men with that kind of injury to expect that they'll be able to do most of what they could before.
That was true. They did say that. Thomas had heard them.
I can't say as that'll come true in every case. They do like to jolly you along. But I was there long enough to see some go from needing bath chairs to up and walking about on their new legs.
That's encouraging,
Hurston said.
I'd wondered if this specialist hospital business was just a matter of, well, stashing you away out of sight.
No, sir. They'll work you quite hard, the physios.
Thomas explained some of the therapies he'd seen. Men with missing limbs who weren't ready for a prosthesis were fitted with sleeves that allowed the stump to be attached to weights and other exercise apparatus.
They have stationary bicycles for the leg cases and all sorts. The stump's got to be completely healed before you can try standing up on it, but if you don't use it for all that time, the muscle wastes away.
Muscle wastage was one of the problems he'd had with his shoulder, from having it immobilized for months. Thomas imparted a few more encouraging details and left Hurston in a better frame of mind than when he'd arrived, if Thomas did say so himself. After a quick check on his other patients, he went outside to smoke a cigarette. The talk with Hurston had taken his mind off his own troubles for a bit, but, as usual, they were still waiting right where he'd left them. It didn't seem as though her ladyship's chat with Major Clarkson had borne any poisonous fruit. At least Thomas had detected nothing unusual in his manner, but Anna's betrayal still stung. It was bad enough she'd assumed that he'd been the one to make the mistake that led to Turnbull's death, as though he would. But he wondered if she'd gone as far as believing that nonsense that O'Brien spouted about the 47th and his wound. She'd better not have. It was nonsense. The wardmaster, the whole 47th, knew how good he was at ward work, even if Anna didn't. A small logical part of his mind pointed out that Anna had no way of judging for herself whether he was any good as an orderly or not. She'd never seen him work, and wouldn't know what to look for if she did. But he ignored it. The side door opened and Nurse Crawley stepped out. "Could I possibly scrounge another of those?" she asked, indicating a cigarette. "Sure." Thomas offered her the case. "Thank you," she said, selecting one. "I don't dare buy my own in the village. It wouldn't be 10 minutes before word got round to Mamma or one of my sisters. Or worse, Granny." That was probably true. The village had an insatiable appetite for gossip about the Crawley sisters. Thomas weighed the merits of pointing out that most people would solve the problem by nicking some from the hospital supply, but decided against it. It's all right. He was living rent-free in her family's house. He supposed he could spare a cigarette now and then. He passed her the lighter, and she lit her cigarette. "I heard Captain Prescott's improving." "He's holding steady at any rate," Thomas agreed. Really, he was improving. He'd been allowed a dish of gruel at midday, but Thomas didn't want to jinx it.
Doesn't happen often with abdominal wounds.
He's lucky he has you looking after him. That, Thomas thought, might actually be true. When Thomas got back to the house in the morning, he found a parcel on the servants' hall table with his name on it and a note from Anna. Thomas, picked this up for you in Thirsk. Anna. It was an alarm clock, and, he realized, a peace offering. Part of him didn't want to accept it. He could buy his own bloody alarm clock. Thank you very much. But it wasn't as though he suffered from an excess of people wanting to make it up to him after they'd insulted him. So, he said when she came down from seeing the young ladies, be nice not to have to look at Bates first thing when I wake up. I'm sure it's a hardship, she said.
Not sure how much longer I'll be on night duty, he added. Sister Crawley had said as much before he'd left that morning, maybe a couple more nights. Captain Prescott's doing all right.
He's the one with the, what did you call it? Abdominal wound?
Thomas nodded. Not too many of those make it, but he's holding steady, and several of the others have learned how to do the dressing change now.
Good, she said heartily.
An awkward silence followed. Thomas went on shoveling his breakfast into his mouth.
Did you hear that Mr. Matthew's visiting this weekend?
Mouth full, Thomas shook his head.
It's a shame he couldn't get away for Christmas, but I suppose they can't let them all off at the same time. They'll ask him and Miss Crawley to dine here on Saturday. Lady Sybil will be hearing any minute now that her ladyship expects her to put in an appearance.
Could be tricky if we get a convoy on Friday, Thomas noted. They often did.
Well, they'll have you.
True enough.
And, in fact, he'd better plan on being there if neither Nurse Crawley was available.
That they will. It would be nice to see Cousin Matthew, Sybil thought, but it still felt very strange to get up in the afternoon and put on an evening frock instead of her uniform. She was going to go down to the hospital after dinner. Mamma had, after Sybil appealed to Papa, agreed that she could, and for now Corporal Barrow was covering for her. It was also strange to see Cousin Isabel in an evening dress. Not that their uniforms would look any less out of place here in the library. Papa and Cousin Matthew, on the other hand, looked both splendid and official in their red and gold mess dress uniforms.
I wish we had an evening version of our uniforms, she remarked to Cousin Isabel.
The men would consider that an example of feminine frivolity, I'm afraid, said Cousin Isabel. Never mind that they have them. Besides, nurses don't often go to the sort of affairs that require evening dress. True, men had regimental dinners, but they had nothing of the kind. Sybil wondered idly if Mamma would let her invite the other VADs to dine, though perhaps it would seem to be rubbing their faces in her social position if she did. They went in to dinner a few moments later. Thinking about what Corporal Barrow had said, she found herself watching William as he and Carson served the first course. She'd only been watching for a moment or two when he noticed her watching and looked at Carson in mute appeal. Carson frowned slightly. She'd not have noticed it if she hadn't been watching. Right, one only noticed the wallpaper if something was wrong with it. Guiltily, Sybil went back to ignoring William and said to Cousin Matthew,
Corporal Barrow sends his regards, by the way.
He'd mentioned that they'd run into one another a time or two in France. Does he? Matthew asked, helping himself from the dish that William held out. Perhaps you could tell him I was glad to hear he's all right. Mother says he's on medical leave, but also working at the hospital here.
That's right, Sybil said. Unofficially at the moment, though I'm sure we all hope he can stay on once his leave is up.
It isn't quite as simple as that, Cousin Isabel warned.
The army may well decide he's needed more somewhere else.
I expect his unit in France is keen to have him back, Cousin Matthew said. Before Sybil could explain that that wasn't possible, Mamma asked,
Are they really?
Her tone was strangely sharp, and Matthew seemed to find it as puzzling as Sybil did. Well, I haven't asked, but I imagine so. I certainly got the impression they relied on him there.
As we do at the hospital here,
Cousin Isabel added, and then explained to Matthew,
We don't expect he'll be going back to France. The use of his arm is a bit too limited for that, but his nursing skills are excellent. Well, I'm very glad to hear that, said Mamma. I had formed a different impression.
How on earth would Mamma have formed an impression of Corporal Barrow's nursing skills? Before Sybil could ask, Cousin Matthew said, He was really rather helpful earlier this year, when there was a bit of a problem with one of my men who was a patient at the dressing station. Cousin Robert, you'll understand what I mean when I say he got me in to see the Master Sergeant on the spur of the moment.
Papa nodded. He did indeed look impressed. Mary asked, "How's the Master Sergeant, and why is that so important? Wouldn't you outrank him?" Matthew said, "Technically, but a new army subaltern who pulled rank on a regular army Master Sergeant would regret it." "He's a very senior, enlisted man," Papa added. "I not have expected one to give me the time of day when I was a new lieutenant." "He gave me the better part of an afternoon," Cousin Matthew said. "But it was very clearly on Barrow's account, not mine. He's something of a rising star. Or was, I suppose, if you're certain he's not going to be sent back." He added to Cousin Isabel, "Well, it seems France is lost as the home service is gained," Cousin Isabel said. Thomas made it back to the house just as they were sitting down to dinner in the servants' hall. Apparently, Nurse Crawley had raced down to the hospital to relieve him as soon as her ladyship excused her. He squeezed into a place between Ethel and the hall boy, Daisy hurrying to set a place in front of him. "Why didn't you say you'd be back for dinner?" she scolded. "I didn't know I would," he answered. "I was covering for Nurse Crawley. She didn't know when she'd make it to the hospital." Carson cleared his throat.
Covering for whom?
"Oh, for pity's sake!"
Nurse Crawley, Thomas repeated. "The younger, as she prefers to be known, professionally."
Carson sighed lugubriously. "Don't fuss," Miss Hughes said to him. "How was Mr. Matthew?" They talked about Mr. Matthew for a while, Carson occasionally dropping a tidbit of what he had said or done at dinner, and the rest of them repeating the same sort of things about how nice it was that he was in England and had been given leave, and what a shame it was that it hadn't been over Christmas. After quite a lot of that, William said suddenly,
"Thomas, why didn't you tell us you were a rising star in the army?"
Because you've not believed me,"
Thomas answered.
"Who said I was?"
"Mr. Matthew," William said.
"At dinner." "Why were they talking about me at dinner?"
Thomas asked suspiciously.
"I have no idea,"
said Carson.
"I think it was Lady Sybil who first mentioned you," William said. "She and Miss Crawley talked about how they rely on you at the hospital, and Mr. Matthew said they had in your unit in France, too, and that you helped him with something to do with one of his men."
"Did he?" Thomas wouldn't have thought he'd want to bring that up. "Do we need to hear all about how important Thomas is?" O'Brien asked. "Again." She said it as though they sat around discussing Thomas's good points every day and twice on Sundays. Thomas was about to point out that they had never, to his knowledge, discussed the topic before, when Anna beat him to the punch, asking, "When was the last time we had about it, Miss O'Brien?" O'Brien said things like, "Oh, and, well," for a bit, until Carson spoke over her.
"I don't see why we need to discuss it at all."
"I don't know," said Miss Hughes. "I wouldn't say it needs to be a regular topic of conversation, but that a member of this household is serving our country with distinction seems worthy of mentioning." Thomas half expected Carson to point out that he was not strictly speaking a member of the household, but he only ha-bounced.
"Why, thank you, Miss Hughes," Thomas said. "That's kind of you to say."
"I dare say everyone likes to feel appreciated now and then," she replied.